The scene opens with multiple wagons grinding to a halt as armed escorts quickly take formation, sensing another clash about to erupt. From the surrounding land, a swarm of goblin-like creatures wielding crude, mismatched weapons storms forward, clearly intent on plundering everything in sight. The hired fighters immediately step up, meeting the charge head-on, and in moments the battlefield turns into a chaotic slaughter where blood soaks the ground and bodies fall without distinction. Nearby, a heavy-set noble with a thick beard calmly observes the carnage while puffing on a cigar, grumbling in annoyance that these assaults have become a daily nuisance. Lost in his irritation, the overweight man fails to notice several creatures creeping up behind him, ready to strike. By the time he senses the danger, it is already too late for him to react. Suddenly, a long-haired warrior bursts into motion, rushing forward to intercept the attackers. One goblin swings wildly at him, only to be sliced cleanly in two before it can even understand what happened, the man wielding a blade in one hand and a shield in the other. He blocks another strike and retaliates instantly, smashing his shield into a goblin's skull and sending its head flying away. Even so, one furious goblin charges straight at him, driven by rage and the desire for revenge. With clear irritation, the warrior lowers his shield, freeing both hands, and seizes the creature by the head. Gripping its skull with one hand and its arm with the other, he applies overwhelming strength and begins to pull. In a brutal display, he tears the goblin apart with sheer force, ripping its body in two as it screams. The nobleman can only stare, frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend that someone had just split a goblin in half using nothing but his bare hands. His face splashed with dark blood, the boy keeps staring at the torn corpse as the nobleman finally speaks, demanding to know who he is. Yet before that moment truly settles, the scene abruptly shifts to a man seated at a desk, hands moving across a computer keyboard. The narrator explains that ever since childhood, he had loved playing games and never believed there was anything wrong with it. Those virtual worlds were filled with rigid systems, crushing poverty, and societies ruled by nobles at the top. They were also places of betrayal, quiet assassinations, and deaths that struck both friends and complete strangers alike. Above all, those worlds swarmed with countless monsters and savage creatures driven only by destruction and slaughter. The protagonist then names himself Dallin, describing his current form as a tall, long-haired man clad in medieval attire. He pauses, correcting himself, and admits that Dallin is not his true name, memories of his previous life slowly resurfacing. Just before he can reveal that forgotten name, the scene changes again, showing him elsewhere, calmly writing in a book with a feathered quill. Sunlight spills through the window as Dallin sits inside a moving carriage, continuing to jot notes into his journal. A bald man with a thick beard approaches and announces that it is time for the shift to change, calling out to Dallin. Closing his notebook, Dallin asks if anything unusual has occurred, only to be told that the road has been peaceful and not a single goblin has shown itself. The two casually chat about the clear weather and wonder aloud why the creatures have suddenly vanished while Dallin finishes preparing himself. Without warning, the horse-drawn carriage jolts over a stone, making the bald man choke and spray out the drink he was sipping. Once ready, Dallin bids his companion a restful break and steps away. The man wipes his mouth and beard, clearing the spilled liquid, and can only respond by wishing Dallin a safe and productive watch. As Dallin steps down from the carriage, several nearby people greet him cheerfully with morning wishes, and ahead, the convoy rolls toward a massive city rising in the distance, prompting Dallin to explain that 2 years earlier, he had begun this game's tutorial. He recalls that the game's starting zone was known as humanity's last stronghold, a place called the Labyrinth City of Palzion. Staring at the towering fortress and countless buildings, Dallin admits that seeing it in person was far beyond anything he had experienced through a screen. As he heads toward the enormous gates, he explains that the city was vast, crowded with life, and served as the sole entrance leading into the underground labyrinth. According to him, there was no other route that allowed travelers to bypass the monsters lurking below, within a maze rumored to be filled with hidden riches. He adds that at the very bottom of that labyrinth supposedly rested an artifact known as the Wish Stone, capable of granting a single desire. Dallin reflects that this relic was likely his only chance to return home, and that the truth of its existence could only be confirmed by reaching the labyrinth's deepest floor. Suddenly, his thoughts are interrupted when someone calls his name from behind. Turning around, he recognizes the voice as belonging to the same nobleman from before, who casually tells Dallin not to stand on ceremony after being greeted. As Dallin moves closer, it becomes clear that the man is Bokma Galios, the owner of the Galios Emporium, who remarks that they are companions and have no need for formalities. Dallin assumes Bokma must want something from him, causing the noble to laugh in surprise and praise Dallin's sharp intuition, saying that was precisely why he held him in such high regard. With refined manners and a confident smile, Bokma announced that he had a proposal and asked whether Dallin would consider working for his emporium as a dedicated hireblade. The request caught Dallin off guard, since he could not recall anything like this ever occurring during his time playing the game. Bokma explained that his sharp merchant sense told him that while many enhanced warriors already soared and skittered across the labyrinth city, Dallin would soon rise to stand among them. Dallin questioned whether Bokma intended to recruit him before that future arrived, and the noble readily agreed. He added that such an arrangement would benefit Dallin as well, then repeated the question, asking if he would take the offer. To Bokma's surprise, Dallin declined, prompting the noble to reach into his coat and remark that he had expected this response. Bokma pulled out a pouch filled with coins and stated that it was the agreed commission, totaling 15 shillings. Dallin frowned in confusion, pointing out that his usual fee was only 10 shillings, and that he had assumed it would be even less since he joined midway, but Bokma calmly replied that the extra amount was an investment. He explained that he wished to secure a strong connection with a promising fighter, and Dallin could not help but smile at the sincerity behind those words. To settle things, Bokma asked Dallin not to brush him aside in the future, and Dallin agreed, saying the arrangement sounded fair. The noble then held out his hand in farewell, telling Dallin they would meet again soon. Dallin clasped his hand in return, smiling back as he realized Bokma genuinely seemed trustworthy, and their exchange ended with a firm handshake. As evening settled in and the sky darkened with the setting sun, crowds moved through the streets of the labyrinth city, and among them walked Dallin, his expression distant and uncertain. Lost deep in thought, he paid no attention to the people passing by, his mind replaying Bokma's earlier proposal and how he had never encountered anything like it during his time playing the game. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he had never seen such an occurrence before, which meant the flow of events could shift based on his choices. He admitted to himself that the offer had been extremely appealing, yet the moment he arrived in this world, he already had a path laid out for him, something that could not be ignored. Continuing onward, Dallin wandered through busy roads, narrow alleys, and quieter outskirts of the city. He passed through rundown districts filled with poverty before eventually stopping in front of a building marked by a sign. After examining it, Dallin nodded with confidence, certain he had found the correct location, and stepped toward the entrance. Pushing the door open, he entered a lively tavern packed with people drinking, shouting, and talking over one another. Groups of mercenaries laughed loudly as they shared stories of completed jobs, while others sat silently, drowning their frustration and fear in endless cups of alcohol, and a few had already passed out, slumped over their tables. Rather than being unsettled, Dallin felt pleased, remarking that this was exactly the kind of place he had been looking for. As he walked further inside and scanned the room, he began to reflect on the early stages of the game, when something had once caught his interest, and, turning his head slightly, Dallin noticed a faint glimmer nearby that instantly drew his attention in surprise. A cruel grin spreads across Dallin's face, revealing faintly sharp teeth as he focuses on what caught his eye. And within that glow he recognizes a pale, transparent corpse that looks more like a lingering spirit than a body. A system window appears, announcing that he has found the remains of a miserable soldier, clearly slain by repeated dagger wounds. The system explains that by claiming the body, Dallin can obtain the fallen man's skills, abilities, and belongings. Staring at it with interest, Dallin thinks to himself, questioning what kind of weapon or method would be best to conquer such an absurdly brutal game. Reaching forward, he stretches out his hand as streams of green light surge into his arm, and as the corpse is absorbed, Dallin declares that he will reach the game's ending no matter the cost. The scene then shifts to Dallin at his computer, calmly stating that he has always enjoyed games that pushed players to their limits. While adjusting his equipment, he explains that he especially loved precise control, often called physics-based gameplay. Because of that, simple and forgiving games quickly bored him. This particular game, however, proved punishing even for him, as he watches his character be torn apart by a massive ogre on the screen. As the game over message appears, he remarks that the protagonist started off weak while the enemies were overwhelmingly powerful. The game's world itself was collapsing, sliding steadily toward destruction. Every ally he encountered either fell under demonic influence or secretly plotted to betray him. Surviving on energy drinks and sleepless nights, he recalls dying nearly 100 times. Yet despite everything, he remains stubbornly determined to witness the game's conclusion by any means necessary. A system prompt suddenly pops up, asking whether the player wants to purchase the chosen items, offering only a yes or no option. And seeing it, Dallin feels irritation rise as he mutters that he will pay anyway, wondering what kind of twisted game demands money just to reach the ending. Sliding his mouse over the confirm button and clicking it, he remarks that he would have deleted the game long ago if he had not already poured so much time into it. Back in the present, Dallin slams a mug of meat onto the table with a tired sigh, complaining that he really should have uninstalled that cursed game. Turning his head slightly, he looks at the transparent corpse lying on the floor while the rest of the bar continues drinking and laughing as if nothing is there. Still watching the figure, Dallin notes with relief that he is confident no one else can see it. This mechanic was known as the Inheritor DLC, a system that allowed a new character to take over the powers of the main character who died in the previous run. For players who had died countless times, this meant limitless potential for growth. After placing a few coins on the counter to cover his drink, Dallin stands up and comments that the system had one serious drawback. It required the player to physically travel to the exact location where the character died and personally retrieve the corpse. Standing before the body, still unsure and struggling to accept how suddenly his life had changed, Dallin slowly reaches out his hand. Activating the skill, he begins collecting the remains, and the green glow surrounding the corpse starts flowing toward him. Moments later, Dallin is engulfed by the swirling green aura, silently watching as the strange power fully surrounds his body. As the glowing energy pours into him, Dallin feels his power, skill, and every rightful attribute steadily rise. Yet an unexpected alert suddenly appears, making him pause and glance to the side in confusion. The system announces that he has unlocked a technique called Dahamon's Armored Combat and proceeds to explain its effects. Staring at his hand, now holding a faint purple sphere of energy, Dallin clenches his fist using the new skill and briefly wonders how the previous owner ever possessed such an ability. Choosing not to dwell on it, he smiles in satisfaction, thinking about the endless opportunities this power could bring. Declaring that his business there is finished, Dallin turns to leave, only for a man seated at a nearby table to focus his attention on him. Surrounded by several lackeys, the crime lord remarks that he has never seen Dallin before and assumes he must be a mercenary, asking what brought him to this place. He then questions whether Dallin understands the rules of business in this establishment, prompting Dallin to ask what he means. Slightly intoxicated, the bandit explains that the so-called rule is a payment fee that Dallin must hand over to him and to Maroon, the tavern's manager. Maroon adds that as long as this payment is made, Dallin would be free to eat and drink without trouble. Hearing this, Dallin immediately recognizes it as a threat. As the man continues speaking, Dallin's gaze shifts to a dagger tucked into the bandit's pocket, and he instantly recognizes it. Memories of the corpse he just absorbed surface in his mind, and Dallin realizes this was the very scum who had killed him before. Unfortunately for the bandit, Dallin calmly replies that he has no money to offer, causing Maroon to grow visibly irritated as he demands to know whether Dallin truly has nothing at all. Maroon steps right up to Dallin, looming over him while releasing a killing intent so thick it feels suffocating, and the bulky bald thug at his side moves to strike, only for Maroon to halt him, claiming it was fine and that Dallin would be allowed to leave. With a mocking tone, the bandit asks whether Dallin had paid for his drink, and Dallin answers that he had. Pretending to be generous, Maroon tells him to be on his way, saying he will overlook the matter this time and spare him. Dallin calmly turns toward the exit and reaches for the door, unaware that behind him Maroon's presence twists into something unhinged and dangerous. In a sudden shift, the bandit pulls out his dagger and lunges forward with violent intent. Dallin appears oblivious, his eyes fixed ahead as he is about to step outside. Then, in an instant, he turns around with an even more terrifying pressure and states that he already saw it coming, striking back without hesitation. Outside, pedestrians continue their nightly routines, unaware of what is about to happen. Without warning, the tavern door explodes open as Maroon is blasted through it by Dallin's blow, the door tearing free as the man is hurled across the street. His body slams into a distant wall, his head and back crashing hard before he collapses to the ground in a daze. Rolling his neck, Dallin mutters that he would not be tricked by such a pathetic move twice and spits out an insult. Furious and disoriented, Maroon shouts for all the bandits inside to attack at once. In moments, armed men pour out and surround Dallin from every side. Staring at Dallin's size and presence, Maroon questions whether he is even human and wonders if he came from some distant northern land. Feeling slightly awkward, Dallin scratches his cheek and glances around at the encirclement. Then his expression shifts, a sinister smile forming as he recalls his newly acquired skill and thinks that this was the perfect opportunity to try it out. Showing no trace of fear, Dallin casually lets his sword and shield fall to the ground, rolls his shoulders, cracks his fingers, and makes it clear he plans to fight with nothing but his hands. With a taunting grin and mocking gestures, he beckons the bandits forward, openly inviting them all to come at once. Enraged by his behavior, the group rushes him, shouting that he was far too conceited as they close in from every side. One thug armed with a short knife leaps forward, screaming for Dallon's death, but Dallon calmly gathers a violet glow into his palm, waiting patiently like a predator for prey to step closer. At the exact moment the blade is about to strike, Dallon opens his hand briefly, snaps it shut, and drives a brutal punch into the man's stomach. The force sends the attacker flying several meters away, his body going limp before he hits the ground, likely already dead. Even shaken by what they witnessed, the remaining bandits surge forward, two of them raising their weapons with clear intent to kill. A bald brute swings his sword, but Dallon slips aside with ease and counters, hurling the man away like a rag doll. Another attacker manages to land a hit with a wooden club, only to stare in horror as the weapon shatters on impact without leaving even a mark. The bandit wearing a bandana freezes, shocked and frightened, unable to understand how a human body could feel harder than steel. Dallon seizes the opening and slams the back of his fist into the man's abdomen, dropping him instantly. As more enemies rush toward him, Dallon does not retreat or hesitate. Instead, he flashes a cruel smile, fully confident of the outcome. Across the street, Maroon, battered and furious, snarls that he pays these men to follow orders and screams at them to kill Dallon at once. Despite hesitating after hearing their leader shout, a blonde bandit suddenly lunges from behind, attempting to drive a knife into Dallon's back. But before the man can even register what happened, Dallon twists sharply and snaps his heel up into the attacker's jaw. As the first man crashes to the ground, another thug rushes in with a dagger aimed straight at Dallon. Yet this time Dallon reacts at the last instant, the clash kicking up a thick cloud of dust that blinds everyone for a brief moment. When the dust clears, it becomes clear that Dallon has seized the blade with his bare hand, slicing his skin in the process. Without hesitation, while locking his opponent in place, Dallon swings a heavy punch into the man's face, the bandit still unable to understand how the dagger had been stopped by flesh alone. The blow sends him tumbling several meters away, where he collapses unconscious. Clearly dissatisfied, Dallon mutters in annoyance, brushing dirt off his chest as he looks around. Glancing at the fallen enemies, he remarks that he had only intended to grab the man's wrist, blaming the mistake on his low mastery of the skill. Checking his status, Dallon notes that Dahamon's armored combat had risen by only 1%, grumbling that the game truly was unforgiving. As he turns around, a bald figure steps into view, demanding to know what just happened. Drawing attention to himself, the tavern keeper angrily accuses Dallon, shouting that beating people in the open street was unacceptable and that being a mercenary did not excuse such behavior. Losing all interest in arguing and taking the man's words as a threat, Dallon suddenly pulls out an axe. While the bartender keeps ranting that if the guards heard about this, Dallon would suffer for it. Yet before the warning can finish, the axe is already spinning through the air toward him. The bald man barely notices the blur as it slams into the wood beside his head, fear instantly freezing him in place. Dallon casually apologizes, claiming the weapon slipped from his grip, then walks over and yanks the axe free as the man trembles in silence. Holding the axe and releasing a chilling pressure, Dallon calmly asks the bartender to repeat what he was saying. Later that night, near a small cabin, Dallon casually tosses a heavy pouch of gold upward, remarking that one should always know who they are threatening. Since Maroon had been the inn's owner, Dallon ended up earning a considerable amount from the incident. As he strolls through the city streets, he adds that this money would let him stay somewhere comfortable without any concern. After walking a short distance, a receptionist greets him warmly, announcing that he has arrived at the Sword and Shield Inn. The man asks how long Dallon intends to stay, explaining that mercenaries receive discounts based on their rank. Dallon replies that he plans to remain for a week and takes out a silver necklace, stating that he is a silver-ranked mercenary. The receptionist nods and explains that his rank grants free breakfast and lunch, while dinner costs extra, with the room priced at 7 shillings. Staring at the pouch of coins, Dallon feels a hint of dissatisfaction, thinking the price is still too high. But with no better alternatives, he places the money on the counter and makes his way to room 412. Once inside, he removes his armor and weapons, carefully setting them down on the bed. Walking to the window, Dallon gazes at the moon hanging in the night sky and remarks that this was where everything truly began, since survival was the most crucial step before ever reaching the game's end. Lost in thought, he reflects that stopping this world from falling apart would require him to grow far stronger, and that strength would demand both wealth and experience. Sadly, with his current gear and limited abilities, achieving that seemed nearly impossible. He needed gold to purchase better equipment, and had to level up enough to properly use his higher-tier skill. Thanks to his countless failed runs, the remains of his past characters were scattered across the continent, giving him a chance to grow at an incredible pace. Clenching his hand with resolve, Dallin decides that if he gathers every one of those corpses, he could surpass his former limits. As images of the world's monsters cross his mind, he realizes time is scarce, and preparation must be swift. Thinking carefully, Dallin searches for a unique quest that would allow him to earn money while collecting bodies and traveling the land at the same time. He concludes that to do this, he would need to meet the master of the nest. The following day, in a different location, an establishment marked with a raven emblem comes into view. Inside, the room glows with an eerie purple light, and tables are covered with assorted gear, ancient books, and bottles filled with magical elixirs. A striking young woman leans her cheek against her palm as she softly repeats the name Dallin, her eyes scanning a document spread across the table before her. Seated comfortably in a chair, she studies a report filled with detailed information about him. The following morning, sunlight spills over the inn and the surrounding buildings of the Labyrinth City. At the front desk, the receptionist offers Dallin a polite farewell and wishes him safety as he departs in haste. Still feeling slightly uncertain, Dallin wonders whether he should move immediately or wait for a better opportunity. He begins walking through the city's streets and outer districts, steadily heading toward his intended destination. After some time, the familiar raven symbol comes into view, and Dallin remarks that he has finally found the place. Examining the building, he notices it is in terrible condition, overgrown with creeping vines and showing clear signs of neglect. Without waiting for permission, Dallin steps inside and calls out, asking if anyone is present, only to find that the interior resembles a tavern lit by a glowing purple crystal. As he looks around, Dallin observes that the door is unlocked, yet the nest's owner is nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, something draws his attention, and he turns toward another door, suspecting someone may be hiding there. Behind it, the same woman from the previous day is concealed, gripping a crossbow. Realizing the situation, Dallin calmly says that there has been a misunderstanding. He then returns to the entrance and knocks in a specific rhythm, a coded signal known only to him and a select few. Hearing it, the girl stays quiet for a moment before letting out a sigh, finally recognizing what it means. Before opening the door, she asks impatiently how many times she needs to repeat herself, then swings it open and scolds that people should only visit outside business hours if the matter is urgent. When her eyes land on Dallin, she notices how much taller he is than her and remarks that she has never seen his face before. Letting out a tired sigh, Dallin comments that if she wants her business to flourish, she should broaden her clientele, especially since a place like this ought to be bustling, which leaves the girl momentarily speechless. With a faintly mocking smile, she replies that she is more than competent and adds that Dallin talks far too much for a customer from the north. Correcting herself, she asks how a so-called savage dares to lecture someone like her, then questions whether Dallin even understands what she means, to which he calmly agrees. Dallin responds that it would indeed be troublesome if he were merely a barbarian who migrated at the age of 2, confusing her slightly with his wording. He clarifies that he was raised with manners from a young age and adds that unlike an informant, she does not seem particularly skilled with foreign tongues. Hearing that, the girl fails to fully suppress her laughter and calls Dallin a letdown. She then offers a brief apology, admitting she did not expect to be outwitted so politely. Turning away with a smile, she walks back to her seat and says that since he is a customer, she will prepare tea. As she moves, Dallin notices the crossbow still in her hand and breaks into a nervous sweat, realizing his chest was nearly pierced moments earlier, while the girl, clearly aware, chooses to ignore his reaction. Inside, she pours tea for him and says that even if he has heard rumors about her, proper introductions are still necessary. She introduces herself as Sienna, claiming she is merely an informant for the Raven's Nest, while casually revealing that she is actually its owner. Dallin then introduces himself in return, stating that he came because he heard this place accepted all kinds of missions. Sitting across from him, Sienna confirms that Dallin is free to accept missions if he wishes, but then asks how he even learned about this place. Dallin answers that Bukba was the one who mentioned it, adding that Bukba warned him to drink alcohol if it was offered but to stay away from tea. Annoyed, Sienna clicks her tongue and complains that Bukba talks far too much, then asks whether Dallin had saved his life. Dallin replies that it was more or less the case. Sienna explains that the knocking pattern Dallin used is known only to people who are truly trusted, which is why she had taken precautions. Dallin responds that such extreme measures cause unnecessary damage for what was meant to be simple caution. Changing the topic, Sienna asks if he is interested in taking a job. She admits that despite everything, she still cannot judge how close Dallin is to Bukba, since this is their first real meeting. For that reason, she can only offer minor tasks for now, missions that would not seriously affect her operations even if Dallin were to fail. Dallin smiles and says that is perfectly fine for an introduction, and Sienna returns the smile. With amusement, she adds that she would like to personally see the strength of the legendary warrior who tore a goblin apart with his bare hands. Elsewhere, in a distant and rundown district of the city resembling a slum, Dallin walks while reading the details printed on a flyer she gave him. He mutters that Sienna is as sly as a fox, realizing that her claim of not knowing him was a complete lie. From the moment he entered the city, she already had gathered information about him, long before he decided to visit her. After wandering a bit more, Dallin steps into a section of the city's sewer system and suddenly notices something unusual. This was the lower street on the edge of the Bronze territory. Knowing he had found the right spot, Dallin started to think things through. There had been a series of people disappearing around this street, which was why he got the mission to investigate. Over the past month, several people vanished near the entrance to Low Street. Dallin carefully stepped inside, ready to search, while it was explained that these kidnappings happened every 3 to 5 days. Lately, a young man went missing, so whoever was behind it seemed to be growing bolder. Dallin entered the sewer and scanned the area. He remembered reading that the most recent disappearance took place here, so he began to look for clues. Suddenly, something caught his eye, a shadow ahead. He spotted a monster talking to itself about its stomach. The creature looked somewhat human, but moved on all fours like a wild animal. Dallin quickly pulled out his sword and shield, preparing to fight. But as he stared at the beast, he realized it was the same rat-like humanoid that had devoured one of his past bodies. The system alerted him that he had found the hunter's corpse, a challenge set to test him. It also suggested that by defeating the monster that consumed a body, Dallin could inherit the skills and items of the fallen. Facing the creature, Dallin noticed thick veins running along its back and its terrifying, monstrous form. Dallin lets out a quiet grin, thinking he never expected to locate his mark this fast. He figures fortune is on his side, while a system notice explains that killing and absorbing the target will grant him the abilities of the corpse the creature consumed. He lifts his shield in front of him and remarks that the enemy must be a weak half-monster or perhaps an early-stage boss. Thinking back to their first encounter, he remembers the rat being as massive as an ogre, large enough to smash buildings with ease. In a chilling, unnatural voice, the creature mutters that it barely found anything to eat today and that tiny meals no longer satisfied its hunger. Dallin shifts into a fighting pose and notes that since this is the start of the game, the creature is still incomplete and growing. Understanding this, he decides it works in his favor, since he won't have to face the monster at its peak, making the fight far simpler. With a cruel grin, Dallin says he can end it before it ever reaches its maximum power. Enraged and stripped of any human mind, the beast glares with wild eyes and bared fangs as it rushes at Dallin's life. It charges forward, swinging its huge, razor-like claws, ready to rip him apart. Dallin, already expecting this, calmly steps back and avoids the strike with ease. Using the opening, he snaps forward and slams his foot into the creature's stomach. The force sends the monster flying several meters away, shredding its midsection with brutal impact. It crashes headfirst into a sewer wall, leaving it badly hurt and dizzy. As it turns back toward Dallin, it's clear that part of its skull has been crushed. Yet moments later, a foul pink substance oozes over the wound, sealing it as the injury rapidly heals. Watching the creature heal itself, Dallin's patience snaps as he realizes the monster is far from weak. In a flash, the creature spins around and lunges again, rushing toward Dallin with clear intent to kill. Showing no hesitation, Dallin swings his blade with full force, aiming to split it apart. Yet the strike only tears open its abdomen. The enraged monster howls in agony as Dallin notices his slash failed to cut deep enough. Still writhing and groaning, the half-human creature bends forward, clutching its stomach as blood spills out. Seeing his foe collapsed on its knees, Dallin lifts his sword high, ready to deliver the final blow and end everything. Suddenly, with tears spilling down its face, the creature pleads for mercy, claiming it was once human. Shocked by this, Dallin asks if it is truly conscious now, and the creature weakly confirms. Sobbing uncontrollably, it says it never chose this fate, crying as tears continue to fall from its eyes. It keeps weeping in despair, insisting it never wanted to eat anyone and that certain people forced this monster inside its body. Dallin demands to know who those people were. The creature replies that it doesn't know their identities, only that they wore dark robes and hid behind masks. It explains that those figures used odd potions and strange magic to change him into this form, prompting Dallin to ask about the masks. Still breaking down over everything he endured, the creature says the masks were golden, smooth, and marked with an exaggerated painted mouth. Hearing this description, Dallin recalls something troubling and mutters that those people will only cause him more trouble in the future. He concludes that he must be ready to confront them when the creature suddenly falls into deeper despair, asking how anyone could do such things to people. Dallin calmly tells him it was never his fault, leaving the creature stunned and shaken by the response. He says the true blame lies with the ones who twisted the man into a monster, so there's nothing more to fear, and Dallin calmly adds that he will erase every last one of them. Yet that moment the creature suddenly begins to convulse violently. Rising unsteadily to its feet, Dallin quietly offers his thanks, sliding his blade back into its sheath and thanking the monster again, while the man, sobbing uncontrollably, confesses that those people had forced him to eat the flesh of his own daughter. Even as Dallin turns his back and starts walking away, the monster keeps rambling, describing how they pried his mouth open and made him swallow meat, sinew, and organs, but then something inside him snaps, his aura twisting back to its former state, turning thick, savage, and terrifying as he growls that he is starving. Losing himself once more, the beast plunges into madness and lunges at Dallin from behind, charging straight at him while his guard is down. Sensing the shift too late, Dallin clenches his teeth in frustration, his irritation boiling over as he draws his sword again. And before the creature can reach him, he spins around and, as an act of mercy to end its torment, strikes it down in a single motion. The monster's head is sent flying several meters away while its half-human body collapses into the filthy sewer water. And the system announces that Dallin has slain the monster that devoured his corpse, revealing the existence of a newly discovered body. Staring down at his old remains alongside the monster's lifeless shell floating in the water, Dallin mutters a curse at the world as the system calmly asks whether he wishes to absorb it. The scene then shifts back to the Raven's nest as late afternoon fades into sunset, and inside the inn, Sienna is shown asking if Dallin has finally returned, only for him to step through the entrance moments later, his face dark, weary, and filled with barely contained anger. Sienna casually asks if he wants something to drink, but without bothering with small talk, Dallin drops the sack he was holding onto the table and bluntly says that he caught the man they were hunting. When Sienna opens it and sees what lies inside, her face twists in disgust, yet she stays silent, and at that moment she understands that the story about ripping a goblin apart was no exaggeration, realizing both of them had been deadly serious all along. Reaching beneath the counter, Sienna takes out a pouch of coins and remarks that regardless, Dallin did well, handing over the promised 15 shillings. With an awkward and slightly flustered expression, she adds that he finished far quicker than she thought, but that doesn't mean he deserves extra pay. Still weighed down by what he witnessed earlier, Dallin replies that the reward is already more than enough for a single outing. He then pulls out another pouch from his pocket and sets it on the counter, instantly catching Sienna's attention and making her wonder what it contained. In a flat, emotionless tone, he explains that the bag holds the personal effects of the murdered victims, which leaves Sienna puzzled and faintly unsettled. Staring at it, she hesitates and asks what he expects her to do with something like that since he is giving it to her. Dallin answers that he wants her to pass those belongings on to the victims' families. He offers to cover the cost, but Sienna refuses, saying she is not the type to squeeze money from people under false pretenses and that Dallin can keep whatever she might have earned. Hearing this, Dallin lets out a small, relieved smile, as if a heavy burden has finally slipped from his chest, and he sincerely thanks her. Turning around, he starts to head out, saying he will see her tomorrow, only for Sienna to snap back in annoyance that for the 10th time, he should stop showing up outside business hours. Dallin shoots back that he might consider it if Sienna served him something stronger than tea and stopped trying to poison him, which makes her sigh in quiet pride as she watches him walk away, smiling to herself as she realizes he truly has a good heart. Observing everything, she mutters that this kind of resolve is not something you see in an ordinary mercenary who only looks out for himself, adding that Dallin doesn't strike her as a fool blindly chasing justice for no reason. Growing a little curious, she glances again at the pouch on the counter and sighs once more, murmuring that he really is a fascinating mercenary, and she is certain he could carry out anything she asks of him. By the time night settles in, the scene shifts back to the inn where Dallin is staying, and inside his room, he is once again scribbling lines into a small notebook. It becomes clear that the notebook is his personal journal, where he records that he destroyed a demi-monster destined to become a future calamity and even managed to recover a corpse. He then calls up his status screen and begins examining it closely, noticing that he has obtained a brand new skill called night vision. Seeing how sharply his attributes have climbed, Dallin mutters that, just as he suspected, he needs to retrieve as many bodies as he can in the shortest time possible. This, he believes, is the price he must pay if he wants to mend the doomed future that is slowly drawing near. He recalls several disasters that will soon unfold, including a witch coven that will set a city ablaze and slaughter countless civilians. There is also the hidden cult, lurking in the shadows, performing twisted experiments and pulling strings behind the scenes. On top of that, a vampire legion is marching toward the Empire, intent on tearing it apart and reducing it to ruins. And above all of them stands the evil god, the most dreadful existence of that world and the ultimate enemy of all life. Dallin then recalls the monster's words about the masked figures who were responsible for its suffering. Slamming his diary shut, his irritation boiling over, Dallin rises to his feet and declares that for now, he will act with what power he has. The secret cult of Pal Zion, if ignored, will one day grow into a threat far too great to overlook. Before any of that can unfold, Dallin curls his lips into a sharp, dangerous grin and declares that he will tear them apart one person at a time until none remain standing. The following morning, the scene shifts to the Raven's Tavern, where Dallin regularly collects his assignments. Inside, a bartender is busy polishing a few glass mugs when something behind the counter draws his eye. Dallin walks in, takes a low stool by the bar, and asks for a glass of whiskey. The bartender immediately nods, taps a small bell beside him, and slides the drink over, which Dallin downs without hesitation. Just as he finishes, Sienna suddenly appears, catching him off guard as she asks how long he plans to keep ignoring the rule about only coming during official hours. Dallin calmly answers that if there's a patron and someone serving drinks, then it counts as business time, to which Sienna snaps that he talks far too much. Dallin then asks who he is supposed to kill today, but Sienna flatly tells him that he will not be killing anyone this time. She points toward her office and tells him to go inside immediately because there is something important they need to discuss. Slightly confused, Dallin hesitates, unsure what she means by wanting to talk. Sienna turns away and starts heading into her office, saying that a particular request has arrived meant for a certain individual. Calling out for the so-called low-path hunter, Sienna laughs lightly as she disappears into her office. Once inside, Dallin asks who this low-path hunter is supposed to be and what she wanted to tell him about it. While pouring tea, Sienna asks if he truly didn't realize that this had become his new nickname, earned because he kept chasing criminals through narrow backstreets and hidden alleys. She explains that the name spread naturally and adds that it suits him perfectly as Dallin recalls the string of jobs he has been taking lately. Sienna goes on to say that for nearly the entire past week, he has been doing the kind of work everyone else avoids, jobs that are filthy, risky, and rarely thanked. Dallin fires back that there are plenty of bounty hunters working around the city, but Sienna cuts him off, saying that despite that, he is the one drawing attention. Shifting topics, Dallin asks what this new assignment is about, and Sienna turns toward the wall, reaching up to pull down a stack of documents. Holding the papers, she gives them a playful shake and grins, calling it his little gift. As Dallin scans the contents, his eyes widen slightly, and he murmurs the words, "Magic Tower," clearly caught off guard. Seeing his reaction, Sienna confirms it, explaining that the Magic Tower of El Gaia's from the Fine Silver District is the one that requested him. She quickly adds that she isn't representing the entire tower, but rather a single mage whose status is extremely high. Even more puzzled, Dallin says he has only been working openly for about a week, questioning how the Magic Tower could already know who he is. Sienna answers that one of her well-connected clients must have put in a recommendation for him. She goes on to say that to catch the eye of Magic Tower observers, Dallin must have crossed paths with someone of notable standing, then asks if he remembers meeting anyone important. Snapping her fingers, she says a certain figure comes to mind as she speaks. She mentions the quiet commander of the Bronze Guard unit, and upon hearing that name, Dallin nods, admitting it sounds about right. Sienna explains that this commander has ties to the Magic Tower and is someone she herself would gladly count as an ally. Dallin lifts his teacup for a sip and asks her to explain the details of the job. Later that evening, bathed in pale moonlight, Dallin studies the request in silence. The task concerns the disappearance of an old mage's soul apprentice, the only student of that ancient sorcerer from the Magic Tower of El Gaia's, who vanished somewhere within the city sewers. Walking through the dim streets, Dallin notes that the reward promises a florin for any information and twice that amount if he safely returns the boy. With a faint smile, he reflects that mages treat their chosen disciples like their own flesh and blood, and if this mission succeeds, the Magic Tower would likely owe him a favor. Because of that, he is confident the tower will pay its debt when the time comes. As he keeps moving, Dallin recalls that Sienna mentioned assigning him a capable guide for this task, when suddenly someone startles him by asking if he is Dallin the so-called low-path hunter. The guide steps into view, revealing a young girl, and with a bright smile she greets him, explaining that she will lead him through the sewers for this mission, introducing herself as Penny, the sewer cleaner. Seeing her properly, Dallin is left speechless, thinking that she looks far too young to be doing this kind of work. Deep underground, with Dallin holding a torch to light the way, he asks whether the sewers serve as the foundation of the massive city above, and Penny cheerfully replies that they do, and that maintaining everything down here is her responsibility. Dallin observes that Penny seems deeply devoted to her work, and she proudly agrees without hesitation. He warns her that they could run into criminals or even monsters and asks if she doesn't find it frightening, to which Penny answers that she does feel scared at times, but believes the job is worth it. Breaking into a light sweat, Dallin admits to himself that he is impressed by her attitude, noting how upbeat and optimistic she is. Curious, he asks how long she has been working in the sewers, and Penny replies that it has been roughly 3 years. As they continue onward, Dallin comments that most people quit that kind of work within a year, meaning Penny can be considered a seasoned veteran. After a short while, Penny suddenly stops and announces that they're nearing the location marked on the map. Hearing this, Dallin shifts his focus and glances to the side, asking if this is where the young mage went missing, and Penny confirms it is. Ahead of them, a wide section of the sewers comes into view, filled with strange stone formations and dark, unexplored corners. While examining the area, Dallin reflects that the missing apprentice belongs to the Magic Tower of Elgaias, a group known for earth magic. That would make the underground tunnels an ideal battleground for them. If the boy was truly the direct student of an ancient mage, then he must be exceptionally skilled, making it hard to believe someone of his level could simply be taken without reason. Then the one behind this must be that man. Dallin thinks as his gaze drifts to one side, his mind forming the image of someone still unseen, a figure known among the cult as one of their greatest vessels, a future terror destined to be called a one-man army once his power fully matures. Yet that future is still distant, and for the sake of what is to come, Dallin knows he must end him now while he still can. As he moves forward through the tunnels, staring down at the murky water beneath his boots, Dallin notices something faintly glowing and bends down, realizing he has found a necklace, prompting Penny to explain that it is a one-time defensive spell charm issued to Magic Tower disciples, something Dallin already understands. Examining it further, he sees the crystal has gone dull, meaning the stored spells have been completely used up, which tells him plainly that this place marks the mage's final stand as he surveys the surrounding structures. His eyes settle on a particular shape ahead, and for a brief moment Dallin hesitates, deep in thought, weighing his next move, before calling out for Penny to stay near the entrance. When she answers, he asks calmly if she knows how to fight, then fixes his stare on a specific spot, rises to his feet, and pulls his sword free. Penny replies that she can at least protect herself, and Dallin answers that it will be enough. Preparing himself for the violent clash he senses is coming, Dallin grips his sword and shield, holding the torch in the same hand as the shield, and steps in front of Penny, telling her to remain behind him for now, just as strange beams of light begin to spill out from the tunnel entrance ahead. Dallin watches in silence as several creatures step forward, humanoid frogs standing upright on 2 legs, their bodies twisted and unpleasant to look at. Their long tongues hang out as they drool openly, staring at the 2 of them like fresh prey waiting to be eaten. Seeing this, Dallin calmly labels them frogmen, noting that while they are low-tier monsters, their sharp intelligence makes them far more troublesome than they appear. Glancing behind him, he spots Penny gripping a knife in a ready stance, and with a small nod, he realizes there is no need to worry about her. Without warning, a few of the frogmen rush toward Dallin, driven by the urge to kill him and fulfill their purpose. The moment he sees them move, Dallin shifts his footing and raises his sword to strike. As soon as the first creature reaches him and tries to attack, Dallin slices it cleanly in half before it can even react. 2 more monsters following close behind attempt to take advantage of the opening, hoping to strike while Dallin is occupied. Yet with effortless movements and icy focus in his eyes, Dallin swings again, cutting both creatures down in an instant. Suddenly, Penny stiffens, her expression changing as she stares ahead and urgently tells Dallin to look forward. Turning his attention, Dallin sees another frogman approaching, carrying some kind of weapon. Beyond that, even worse, a swarm of frogmen is pouring in from the entrance, forming a force clearly intent on ending his life. As Dallin wipes the blood splashed across his face, he lets out a laugh, remarking that maybe calling an army is too much, and that it looks more like a full company instead. Wearing a cruel grin as he readies himself once more, Dallin says that it makes no difference at all and prepares to fight again. This time, Dallin rushes straight at the monsters, declaring that once every last beast is dead, nothing else will matter. After a long and brutal exchange, the scene shifts to Penny standing still, her knife soaked in blood, her eyes wide in shock at what she has just witnessed. She can't even find the words to describe it. And when the surroundings come into view, frogmen corpses are scattered all across the sewer floor. Dallin, his entire body drenched in blood, calmly asks if Penny is hurt, and she answers that she is fine, all thanks to him. Walking closer, Penny adds that she has worked as part of the sewer crew for 3 years, so handling a couple of frogmen on her own is not impossible. All of a sudden, Dallin sharply tells her to stop and not take another step, confusing her as he immediately moves to shield her. In the next instant, a blade flashes toward Dallin, and he barely blocks it in time. He quickly tosses aside the weapon he was holding and reaches for his axe, preparing to hurl it. In the pitch-black tunnel, where visibility is almost zero, Dallin throws the axe, sending it spinning into the darkness. A moment later, a horrifying cry echoes, signaling that it struck one of the frogmen. Shaken, Penny asks how he knew something was hiding there, and Dallin replies that monsters grow more aggressive when stalking humans. In truth, he is using his night vision skill, letting him see through the darkness, and he realizes that only 2 remain, with one already running away. Penny asks what they should do next, and Dallin answers that they will pursue the fleeing creature, since its nest can't be far. Looking at Dallin, Penny grows flustered and admits that he is unbelievably impressive. Noticing that she has stopped moving, Dallin lightly nudges her and asks why she is standing around when they need to move right away, and Penny quickly nods and follows. After walking for a long time, they finally arrive at a concealed chamber where a throne stands. Still shaken by everything that happened, Penny leans slightly toward Dallin and gently nudges him, pointing out that someone is seated on the throne ahead of them. Resting upon it is a mage holding a staff with an intimidating presence, and Dallin notes that this is the first time he has ever seen the man face to face. It is the heretical mage who was cast out of the magic tower, Derek Valentino. Sitting comfortably on his throne, Derek asks who Dallin is and whether he was the one who interfered with his experimental subject. Dallin recalls that this pagan mage was one of the figures responsible for the unforgettable death he once suffered. Calmly, Dallin tells Derek that he was indeed the one who killed the rat man, claiming he was merely taking a walk at the time. The mage scoffs and says Dallin is lying, pointing out that no ordinary person casually wanders that deep into the sewers. Slamming his staff against the floor with a thunderous sound, Derek declares that Dallin never should have chased the frogmen that escaped into his domain. At his signal, figures begin to rise from the murky water around them as numerous frogmen slowly emerge. Seeing this, Penny's body starts to shake uncontrollably as she grips her knife, staring forward in fear. Looking around, she realizes there are countless frogmen surrounding them, all poised to rush in and attack. Taking a step back, she says with a trembling voice that if creatures like these were to reach the city, it would lead to a disaster. At that moment, Dallin places a hand against her back, stopping her retreat, drawing her attention and making her cheeks flush as she looks up at him. Dallin keeps a steady and confident expression, silently trying to calm her nerves. Seeing his resolve, Penny understands that no matter how many frogmen there are, Dallin can defeat them, and she no longer feels overwhelmed by despair. With a twisted, unhinged grin, Derek commands his frogmen to rip the 2 of them apart. Showing their massive fangs, the frog creatures rush forward in a savage wave, charging wildly with a clear intent to crush both Dallin and Penny. Dallin stands completely still as the horde storms toward him, blood-soaked blade in hand, calmly telling Penny to remain behind him while he handles everything. Stepping forward on his own, he assures her that this will end soon, his voice steady and without fear. With icy certainty, Dallin declares that once the summoner is killed, every one of these false frog warriors will fall with him. Staring at the countless monsters rushing in while armed with nothing more than a shield and a sword, he mutters that there is only a single solution. His blade flashes again and again, flowing smoothly from one strike to the next, until all that can be seen is blood spraying through the air. A frogman lunging toward him suddenly finds its arm severed, stumbling in agony before it can even understand what happened. Wearing the same chilling expression, Dallin tears through multiple frogs, stating that he will slaughter anything standing between him and the conjurer. Using a single step to gather force, he bursts forward, cutting down several enemies in passing before they can react. As he moves, another frog leaps at him, jaws wide open and lined with terrifying sharp teeth, ready to swallow him whole. But Dallin reacts instantly, grimacing in disgust as he cleaves its jaw apart and stops the attack cold. Landing firmly, he finds himself surrounded on all sides, frogs closing in with no escape route left. Tightening his fist, Dallin strikes with one hand, smashing two of the creatures aside and ending them instantly. Sensing danger behind him, he turns without hesitation and slices another frog cleanly in half before it even realizes what is happening. The fight drags on as more creatures swarm Dallin from every side, trying to overwhelm him with numbers to make up for their lack of power and technique. Yet even so, Dallin's refined sword skills allow him to cut down many of them until his blade finally shatters under the strain. With the endless assault continuing, even his shield is smashed apart, leaving him standing there with nothing but his own hands. Sensing an opening, all the frogmen rush him at once. But Dallin shows no hesitation, choosing to battle barehanded with a clear intent to slaughter every last one of them. Activating Dahamon's armor trait, his fists harden as he snarls that he will wipe out all these filthy frogs. One after another, the beasts strike at him, only to have their skulls crushed and their bellies smashed in by his punches alone. Throughout the chaos, Dallin's face remains icy and unreadable, his fists clenching again and again as they become soaked in blood, showing absolutely no mercy. With a single heavy strike to a frogman's stomach, he sends it flying into several others, knocking them away like broken dolls. Watching this scene, Derek the Mage is seized by fear, realizing that Dallin is not only powerful, but terrifyingly unhinged, and as he sees his summon army being ripped apart by a man fighting with his bare hands, he wonders what kind of monster could possibly stand before him. Staring ahead in disbelief, the pagan wizard fails to notice Dallin closing the distance with an axe gripped tightly in his hands, fully intent on ending him. By the time Derek realizes what is happening and tries to block with his staff, it is already too late. A streak of purple energy flashes from top to bottom, following the path of Dallin's axe as it comes down. When the dust finally clears, Dallin is standing over the fallen mage, having delivered a devastating blow straight through the wizard's skull as the man mutters his final words. Knowing his objective has been achieved, Dallin lets out a slow breath, the tension leaving him as he realizes that it is finally over. A system message appears announcing the death of a wizard, stating that a mercenary who had turned into a pagan mage has been discovered. Dallin recalls the moment he was defeated and absorbed by Derek, remembering that the man carried dragon blood and was used as a test subject, and thinking back on it now, he mutters that the memory is beyond disturbing as he curses the corpse at his feet. The system then asks whether he wishes to absorb the body to obtain its abilities and attributes. Dallin extends his hand, slowly opening his palm, and activates Corpse Gathering to boost his power. Green light surges through his body as his stats rapidly rise, with his energy and mana increasing the most. He also unlocks a skill called Dragon Blood Regeneration, something he once possessed in his previous body, already reaching 6% mastery. His muscles swell as he feels something violent coursing through his veins, causing unbearable pain. A radiant golden glow spreads over his entire body, wrapping him in shimmering light as if he were coated in molten gold. Everyone present, including Penny and the remaining frogmen, stare in disbelief, unable to grasp what is happening before their eyes. For a brief moment, Dallin stands still, enduring the flood of power rushing through him and making him feel overwhelmingly strong. With a calm yet confident turn, he faces the frogmen and asks if they are prepared for what comes next. Witnessing his transformed presence, the frog creatures freeze, shaking uncontrollably in fear. Terrified of what he might do, they turn and flee at once, escaping before he can strike them down. Watching them go, Dallin lets out a quiet sigh, closing his eyes as his thoughts drift elsewhere. His focus is suddenly broken when Penny calls out his name, and Dallin opens his eyes to see her standing there. Dallin walks toward Penny and tells her that he had warned her to keep her distance, while she rushes up to him anyway, asking in a worried voice if he is all right. Still shaken by everything she just witnessed, Penny hesitantly asks whether Dallin is truly human. Dallin tilts his head and asks what she means by that. Penny explains that even if he is human, no normal person is like him, especially after seeing him slaughter dozens of frogmen with nothing but his bare hands. Dallin then asks what she thinks about something, but Penny looks confused and asks why he suddenly brought that up. Dallin replies that he asked only because he didn't know what else to say, and Penny nods, saying she understands, though she adds that she wanted to say something herself. Fidgeting with her fingertips in embarrassment, she admits that even though they just met, he feels different from anyone she has ever known. Blushing deeply, Penny says that standing near him makes her feel like he is capable of anything. She adds that it doesn't matter to her whether Dallin is human or not, because what truly matters is that he is simply Dallin. At that point, Dallin cuts her off and asks her to wait, his own face slightly awkward. He explains that he wasn't asking about her feelings at all. What he actually wanted to know was her opinion on where the pagan mage might have hidden the captives, causing Penny's face to turn completely red. Annoyed and flustered, Penny snaps that if he doesn't properly explain his questions, she can't possibly understand him. Elsewhere, inside a church decorated with an upside-down cross statue, several figures are gathered in conversation. 4 hooded individuals stand together, and one of them says the reason this apostles' meeting was called so urgently is because Derek has been killed. The others react in shock, and one of them demands to know how a pagan mage as powerful as Derek could possibly have been defeated. The mage leading the gathering speaks up, saying that even though Derek was the most recent addition, he was never someone who could be taken down so easily. One of the masked figures asks what exactly happened to him and his force of 500 frogmen, causing shock to ripple through the chamber, and the man answers that more than half of that army was slaughtered while the rest scattered in terror, which ultimately led to Derek's death. Another voice questions whether the city guards were responsible, while others suggest it might have been someone connected to the Silent Company, but each guess is denied. The mage then states that everything was done by a single individual, leaving one of the masked members visibly stunned. As they continue discussing why the fool Derek would dare abduct the direct disciple of an elder mage, an apostle suddenly enters the hall, prompting all the masked figures to bow deeply in respect to the great apostle who oversees everything. This man wears a smiling mask like the rest, yet his movements are refined and overwhelming, his very posture radiating authority as he strides forward, takes his seat upon a throne, and calmly says that they were summoned to be reminded not to fear a mere mercenary. The masked woman who had been anxious asks if it is truly possible for a lone mercenary to wipe out an entire army of monsters. But the chief apostle sharply orders her to be silent, causing her to recoil in fear. He then explains that he has advanced the schedule of the grand plan, stating that Derek's death changes nothing about their objectives. One of the apostles reacts to this, realizing that putting the grand plan into motion means a major turning point has arrived. Finally, the leader commands them to release funds to secure the materials needed for the secret drug and to gather those capable of wielding weapons, adding with clear irritation that if events do not proceed smoothly, they will simply crush everyone through economic pressure, since control through wealth is the very foundation of their growing power. The man declares that nothing has shifted and that the march of evil will begin with them, adding that the day the 7 walls crumble is drawing closer, then commands everyone to prepare for the moment those walls finally fall, while the other apostles remain bowed in silence before their master. Far away and much later, the scene changes to a bronze branch of the magic tower in El Gaias, where an ornate clock ticks softly as the hours pass, and Dallin is seen relaxing in a plush armchair. He recalls Sienna mentioning that the client behind the request wished to meet him in person to offer extra payment, and with a pleased smile, Dallin thinks there is no reason to refuse an additional reward, which is why he came. Growing bored as no one summons him, he opens his status window, which appears instantly before his eyes, and begins reviewing the skill he recently obtained, Dragon Blood Regeneration. Regeneration, a trait inherited from dragon blood, can be adapted to humans, but it drains a massive amount of stamina when used. Remembering how he slept for an entire day after returning from the sewers, Dallin realizes his dragon blood is incomplete, only partially present within him. After some quick calculations, he concludes that using the ability non-stop in combat would leave him utterly drained. Just then, a red-haired man with a thick beard steps into the room, apologizing for making his guest wait unintentionally. Introducing himself as Felver Valentino, the ancient mage of the magic tower of El Gaias. He explains that it has been a long time since he last stayed at the tower, and that he needed time to catch up on matters. Felver mentions ordering tea and asks whether Dallin would like a cup as well, to which Dallin simply answers yes. As the old mage continues speaking, Dallin barely listens, suddenly catching a familiar scent he has not smelled in years, realizing it is coffee, and when he looks down at the cup and confirms it is exactly what he hoped for, his face brightens with genuine happiness. Dallin takes a long sip, savoring the drink and clearly enjoying it. The noble elder chuckles, saying that from Dallin's look, he never would have guessed he liked tea. While sipping, Felver mentions that if Dallin doesn't mind, he can send a bag of coffee beans to the Raven's Nest, and Dallin nods, thanking him. Felver then introduces himself properly, explaining that he is an elder mage of the magic tower of El Gaias and a grandmaster of magical arts. He also reveals that he is Tommy's teacher, the boy Dallin rescued. Hearing this, Dallin recalls saving Tommy and asks if the boy is doing well. Felver smiles and thanks Dallin, saying Tommy is alive and well only because of him. Dallin then inquires if Felver knows why the pagan mage went down into the sewers. Felver explains that by chance the villain discovered his apprentice's trail and followed it, adding that the apprentice had no idea Derek had planned to reach him. The elder again expresses gratitude, praising Dallin for defeating the entire army of frogmen on his own and noting his disbelief that a silver-ranked mercenary could perform so well. Dallin replies that it's foolish to judge someone by a rank alone, and Felver agrees, saying everyone has their own story. Then the mage tosses a bag of coins onto the table, explaining that it is Dallin's reward, 100 silver coins, equal to 1 gold coin. With a confident smile, he adds that Dallin will receive a little extra as well. Picking up a beautifully decorated pouch, he sets it on the table and says it is a gift. Inside, Felver explains, is a regeneration potion perfect for a sword-wielding warrior like Dallin, and he thought it would be useful for him in battle. Felver then adds that he believes Dallin no longer needs it, because dragon blood now flows through his veins, which makes Dallin freeze in shock. Noticing his reaction, the mage quickly raises his hands and tells Dallin to relax, saying he didn't come to harm him, but to propose something. Still annoyed and close to striking, Dallin forces himself to breathe and asks what kind of proposal the mage is talking about. Felver's expression and stance completely change, and he calmly offers Dallin the option to accept a different kind of reward. By sunset, after a long discussion, Dallin is seen walking away from the place. He remembers Felver telling him that he made the correct choice, and Dallin mutters that it must be better than taking the potion. As he walks off, Dallin thinks about how he never expected the mage to be so powerful that he could sense the dragon blood inside him. His thoughts drift to the moment their fight ended, when he noticed his axe had been completely broken. A quiet sadness settles in, since it was his final weapon after his sword and shield had already been destroyed. Penny points out that those weapons are useless now and says Dallin will have to replace them, which makes her pause. Looking a little shy, Penny mentions that her uncle is a blacksmith and asks if Dallin would like to meet him, adding that because Dallin is unusual, she can request a generous discount. Back in the present, Dallin lets out a sigh and says that if he can get a good price, he might as well go, since he has no better choice. In the distance, the forge street of the Bronze Territory comes into view, crowded with people moving back and forth. While walking and scanning the area, Dallin says he thinks this is the place Penny mentioned, though he isn't fully certain. Suddenly, he hears a desperate cry for help. When he turns toward the sound, Dallin is met with a sight so shocking that it leaves him stunned. He watches as a man is violently tossed out of the forge Penny had pointed him to, his arms bound behind his back. From inside, a blond man storms forward after kicking him, shouting that the old fool was ruining everything. The blacksmith, bruised and desperate, pleads for them to stay away from his niece Penny and spits curses at the scoundrels. Taking in the scene, Dallin understands what's going on and recognizes that the beaten man is Penny's uncle. The thug steps out of the forge, sneering that the debt should have been paid along with its interest. With a cruel grin, the blonde thug adds that if there's no money, the blacksmith can offer his niece instead, leaving Penny frozen in horror. Struggling to stand despite the pain from the fall, the blacksmith warns that if the man keeps talking like that, he'll pay dearly for his words. Dallin remains at a distance, quietly watching everything unfold and connecting the dots. The blacksmith Penny spoke of as Lever a famous refiner of mithril. Dallin recalls that in the latter half of the game, Leverin grows rapidly in skill and forges the finest weapons mankind ever sees. He is a crucial blacksmith NPC required for success in the game's later strategy. Snap back to the present. Dallin sees the blonde man pull out a gleaming knife and declare that Leverin can settle the debt with one of his hands. Suddenly, a strong grip clamps down on the thug's wrist, making him snarl and demand to know who dares stop him. In a swift move, Dallin wrenches the blade from the man's grasp and calmly asks that if an old man's hand is worth a gold coin, how much a young man's hand might be worth. The next sound is the thug's scream, echoing across the streets, followed by a brief silence as time passes. The scene shifts to a mug of ale resting on a table, while the blacksmith thanks Dallin for rescuing both him and his niece. Leverin says he already knows about Dallin, since his niece talked about him, and asks while Dallin is drinking if he is looking for a new weapon. Sadly, Leverin admits he can't forge anything proper for Dallin right now because, as seen earlier, he is trapped under heavy debt with the shop. Brushing the drink from the side of his lips, Dallin asks what that debt has to do with crafting weapons. Annoyed, Leverin slams both palms on the table and says the creditors seized all his tools as payment for the interest. He adds that the shop offered to erase the debt if he worked for them for 5 years. But for a small blacksmith like him, shutting down his forge would mean everything was over. And even after clearing the debt, the only road left would be working under someone else forever. Dallin guesses that Leverin tried to hold his ground, which is why the thug showed up to scare him. Leverin ignores the comment and only mutters that he despises those Telia scum, which makes Dallin pay closer attention. Resting his face in his hand, Levrin says that if Dallin came here for that reason, he should give up on it. Suddenly cutting him off, Dallin asks how much money he owes, leaving Levrin stunned. With a confident smile, Dallin says he will clear the debt himself. Dallin starts walking away, but Levrin hurriedly tries to stop him, warning that the sum is far too large for one man. Without turning back, Dallin waves his hand and says everything in this world has a solution, so there's no need to worry. In exchange, he asks Levrin to forge him some weapons. Before leaving, Dallin grabs an axe from the forge, saying it's needed for what comes next. Glancing back with calm confidence, trusting his own strength, he tells Levrin to treat it as an advance payment. At the door, Dallin thanks him for the drink, while Levrin can only stand there and watch him disappear. Levrin turns toward his niece and asks who that man really was, but Penny stays quiet. Looking awkward, she says the first question isn't even whether he was human, yet in simple terms, he was someone truly amazing. That night, in another part of the city at the Galio's Emporium's Bronze Branch, several wagons arrive loaded with food and barrels of drink. Someone speaks to Bokma, who is carrying a wooden beam, asking what Dallin is trying to imply. Dallin straightforwardly asks Bokma if he could lend him some money, roughly a few gold coins. Bokma is left speechless, doing nothing but staring at Dallin. After some time, a figure appears holding a sack of coins, and Dallin comments that it was payment for a job. The scene flashes back to Dallin bargaining with Bokma, explaining that a relative is drowning in debt, and the noble asks for details. While casually eating grapes in the noble's estate, Dallin explains it started as a business loan that kept growing until it became dozens of times larger than the original amount. Once again, Dallin asks if Bokma will lend the gold, and Bokma hesitates, unsure of his answer. Puffing on his pipe, Bokma asks who the debt was made with. Dallin replies that it was the Telia shop. Hearing that name, Bokma's face tightens in clear annoyance. After a pause, Bokma agrees to provide the money. Chewing on an apple, Dallin remarks that it seems Bokma has dealings with Telia as well. Dallin then asks what he must give in return, and Bokma says he needs a moment to think. Crushing his cigar into an ashtray, Bokma explains that the Telia shop is an organization funded through shady means. Because of that, Bokma sets up a meeting with Dallin for the following day. At the same time, Dallin begins to describe Telia as a group secretly formed by the Apostles of Retrograde, a dangerous cult operating outside the law. They hold most of the trade power in the Bronze Territory, a region that serves as the very lifeline of the cult. Dallin never expected a clash with them this early, but now that they stepped in, he knows he must break them. Dallin thinks about charging at them right away, yet they're still recognized as a lawful merchant group, which makes a direct attack dangerous. Before anything else, he has to free Levrin from their grip, and a sudden thought strikes him, making his heart skip. As Dallin looks forward, he notices something he desperately hoped not to see when his eyes fall on Levrin and Penny's forge. Anger boils up as he realizes it's right in front of the shop, meaning the Telia scum have already taken action. Without hesitation, Dallin sprints toward the forge, determined to shield his companions. He spots several men holding blades and clubs gathered outside, clearly preparing to murder Penny and her uncle. One of them orders the old man to come quietly, saying they're only here to collect a bit of money. Gripping a hammer, Levrin refuses to move, hurling curses at the thugs and swearing he'll kill them. A man laughs at him, mocking how terrifying a hammer must be, though it's only meant to provoke him. Standing with many men behind him, the gang leader sneers that even if the old man lasts a few seconds, he can't fight all of them. Weak and far past his prime, the old blacksmith begins to shake, realizing he stands no chance alone. At last, the leader shouts the order everyone expected, telling them to attack the old man and Penny, insulting her as he does. But before he can finish, an axe suddenly spins through the air. In the next instant, the blade slices clean through, severing the leader's hand, and he raises the bloody stump while screaming in agony. One thug opened his mouth to shout a warning about the ambush, but Dallin was already behind him, gripping his neck and snapping it in one swift motion. The rest of the thugs turn in shock as Dallin steps forward, calmly saying he has finally reached a decision. Placing his foot on the dead body, he declares that every hand here is now worth a silver coin. Since the value is decided, he moves on to collect what he is owed. His combat instincts fully awaken. The first man he punches has his face crushed like an empty can under a boot. The second is struck hard in the gut, sent flying as punishment for his choices. The third, even holding a sword, fails to block a single blow. There is nothing these idiots can do to stop him. Still, the remaining thugs try to fight back, but numbers mean nothing in front of him. One of them shouts that there's no need to panic because their enemy has no weapon. Dallin hears this clearly. A small grin forms on his face as he realizes he doesn't need steel to break them. Minutes later, Leverin and Penny stare in disbelief. The street has turned into a horrifying display, with bodies scattered across the ground. One survivor drags himself away, crying that a monster attacked them. A foot presses down on his neck, stopping his escape. With his heel near the man's skull, Dallin ends it without hesitation. Two people who arrived late ask who defeated all these fools. Instead of replying, Dallin throws them a pouch holding 26 coins. Leverin can hardly accept that this young man did all this for his sake. Dallin simply replies that having a blacksmith as an ally costs nothing, as long as Leverin forges the weapons he promised. Scanning the ground, Dallin notices something odd about one body lying still. He grabs the man without hesitation, already aware that the youth is only pretending to be dead. Dallin knows this attack wasn't about a handful of coins, and he wants to learn what the higher-ups were truly planning. Even while restrained, the young man stubbornly says he won't reveal anything. Giving the wrong response, he is quickly struck and brought back to his senses. Losing patience, Dallin tells him this is his final warning and demands he repeat what was ordered inside the shop. Shaking, the man says they were told to take everyone, so Dallin presses further, asking who exactly. Artisans, traders, anyone tied to business, all were targets. Capture them or kill them. Dallin then demands to know who gave such an order. Before the man can finish, his hand twists unnaturally. His body begins to change, yet he manages to say the command came from the owner of Telia's shop. A twisted, beast-like grin spreads across his face. This instantly puts Dallin on guard for what's coming next. Before the transformation completes, Dallin slams the man to the ground. With every passing second, the change grows closer to finishing. Spotting an axe nearby, Dallin grabs it and swings, slicing the man's head clean off. What remains is no longer human, just a headless corpse. Leverin has no idea what he just witnessed, but Dallin explains it was a half-monster. It seems semi-monster transformations can now happen in the real world. This progress is far quicker than Dallin expected. As Dallin turns to leave, he orders them to go inside, lock everything, and stay hidden for several days, but Leverin asks where he plans to go. From his memories, Dallin knows Telia's shop deals in disgusting acts. He then tells Leverin he's heading to the Galio's Emporium, believing they're aiming for one of his rich clients. After finishing his business there, Dallin planned to come back later to collect his armor and weapons, a reply that left Leverin stunned. Inside another room, a massive chandelier filled the hall with light. Bokma thought it was strange coincidence that Dallin had also gone to confront Telia's shop. They had long been suspicious of them, and Bokma recently learned they were purchasing huge amounts of supplies. It looked like they were getting ready for something major, far beyond normal trade. That was when Bokma recalled Dallin asking what he should do if trouble arose. Still, Bokma decided to discuss the details when Dallin returned, believing that starting the morning with coffee was a fine idea. Suddenly, Bokma nearly jumped as someone crashed in through the window. It was Dallin, making a dramatic entrance. Bokma had no time to ask why he appeared so abruptly, because Dallin immediately shouted for him to get down. Arrows suddenly shot through the window, shattering what little glass remained. Shocked, Bokma demanded to know what was happening. Dallin let out a breath, saying that if he had arrived even a bit later, things would have gone terribly wrong. He promised to explain everything soon, but for now ordered Bokma to hide beneath the bed. Moving fast, Dallin hurled the axe in his hand straight out the window. An archer had been hiding on a nearby rooftop. The man's face became the axe's resting place. As Dallin rushed out of the room, he warned Bokma not to move until he came back. Dallin was clearly pleased, knowing he was about to gain more experience. Bokma heard his words, but couldn't make sense of them. Dallin leaped through the window toward the closest roof. Lying beside him was the small body of the archer who tried to stay hidden. Clutched in the axe was a white mask. Dallin scanned the area to understand where he stood. All around, more figures wearing masks appeared, spreading across the rooftops. Their numbers kept growing, showing this was their true fighting force. White and gold masks moved swiftly through the night. It was clear they had no intention of holding back. Getting ready for battle, Dallin tightened his grip on the axe. Time was running short before their larger scheme was set into motion. Something sharp flew straight toward him. With practiced ease, Dallin blocked it using the axe. Staying in one place would only get him killed, so he rushed forward. Several of the masked fools ahead froze in surprise. They struck at him desperately, but their blows only hit the shadow he had already left behind. His first swing of the axe struck clean and true. In the next moment, he was already upon another enemy. This time, the blade cleanly split head from body. Only 3 enemies remained when another projectile came flying at him. Once more, the axe served as a perfect shield. One of them shouted that Dallin must be the warrior who killed Derek. A masked man then stepped forward with calm confidence. They faced each other from separate rooftops. The instant the figure recognized Dallin, he spoke of wanting to drink his blood. He claimed the blood of brave fighters was always sweet. This mask was silver. Dallin hadn't expected someone of such rank to appear. It was Stray Leatherhaven, a lower-tier vampire assassin who relied on poison and memory-based attacks. In the game, reacting to his moves was extremely difficult. Even so, Dallin felt a thrill rise within him, eager to see how this would play out in reality. There was no choice but to confront him head-on. Filled with confidence, Dallin aimed to end everything with a single, decisive blow. The vampire stood still, wearing a grin as if inviting Dallin to step closer. At once, Dallin sensed danger. He had walked straight into a snare. He struggled to block the wooden stakes flying at him, realizing too late that he had rushed in carelessly. Borrowing this body, once used by the enemy, had made him underestimate the threat, and he should have waited. A message suddenly appeared before his eyes. Dallin had identified the butcher who left torn bodies beneath the night sky. Worse still, the recent assault wasn't carried out by Stray alone. The vampire had support from the remaining lackeys Dallin hadn't eliminated yet. Knowing this, Dallin understood he had to wipe out the helpers first. Lunging forward, the vampire complained that his patience was wearing thin and that he craved Dallin's blood already. At the same moment, the henchmen attacked together, loosing crossbow bolts from the flanks. Dallin found himself boxed in from every direction. With remarkable control, he vanished from sight and reappeared among them. His axe struck down the first target without mercy. There was no room for hesitation, and his assault didn't slow. Each blow landed clean and deadly. The ranged attackers quickly fell silent. Their breathing stopped, leaving only the close fighters. Dallin raised his arm and hurled the axe toward them. Before they could even blink, one was struck down. Moving to finish the rest, Dallin activated his combat skill. The axe moved like a storm, cutting through them with ease. One wounded survivor screamed, calling him a monster. Dallin felt a brief sense of relief, knowing only one enemy remained. Without wasting a second, he swung his axe again. But suddenly, Dallin sensed an attack from behind. Reacting instantly, he turned and used the axe to block the incoming shots. What Dallin never expected was the bolts releasing poison on impact. The moment he understood how serious it was, he tried to escape the spreading smoke, but it was already too late and the toxin had entered his body. The vampire mocked him, claiming no ordinary human could endure such a lethal poison. He explained he hadn't used it earlier because of his allies, but with only one left, sacrificing them was acceptable. Even so, Stray felt relieved that he hadn't faced Dallin directly, since Dallin had crushed the others with ease. Knowing this, Stray decided he had to erase Dallin completely. As a vampire, the poison had no effect on him, and he believed the human would soon fall. Moving through the smoke, Stray stepped toward what he believed was Dallin's corpse. As he drew near, he realized it wasn't him at all. The body wore a golden mask. Dallin was already behind him, axe raised and ready to strike. The vampire never expected such a counter, nor that the human was still alive. Although caught off guard, Stray barely avoided the first swing. His thoughts raced, focused on how Dallin resisted the poison. The only conclusion was terrifying. Dallin wasn't human. He was something far worse. Standing before him, Dallin remarked that his eyes were burning. It reminded him of tear gas from his days as a soldier, though the vampire had no idea what that meant. Confused and enraged, Stray lashed out wildly. All he wanted now was for Dallin to die as fast as possible. Dallin only sighed, unfazed by the attack. He didn't bother reacting much, since the vampire's movements were predictable. As dragon blood healed him, Dallin stepped forward, his foot sinking into the rooftop. The vampire's eyes widened as he realized the man was suddenly right in front of him. Even worse, his throat was locked tight in the grip of that monster. Held helplessly, Stray heard Dallin calmly ask if he had any final words. At last, the vampire demanded to know how Dallin survived a poison that should have killed any human, shouting in disbelief that it was impossible, but Dallin calmly told him he was being too loud and crushed his throat without hesitation, adding that the creature was only a low-rank vampire and that a stronger one would have escaped by turning into mist or a bat. And after that, Dallin noticed another corpse nearby, someone who had died earlier trying to kill the vampire. And when the system asked if he wanted to collect the body, he agreed, gaining the vampire's abilities along with 3 points in strength and jumping skill. While inside the house, Bokma was trembling in fear, never imagining he would become the target of an assassination. And even worse, it happened in broad daylight as he stood frozen in the room, gripping his sword, looking out the window and trying to calm himself by reminding himself his head was still attached, wondering if everything had been a dream, but deciding it was wiser to call his guards anyway. Hoping Dallin was still alive as he reached for the door, only for a loud crash to sound behind him, causing Bokma to turn ready to fight before suddenly feeling sick and collapsing to the floor. And downstairs, Dallin muttered that he really needed to control his strength better as he returned and told the owner of the Emporium that the task was finished, only to find him unconscious. Guessing Bokma might have been poisoned, though, he had no idea why foam was forming at his mouth when someone entered the room asking about the noise, and it was Sienna, who immediately assumed Dallin was the cause. Yet Dallin still looked at her and asked why she was there. Sienna arrived with the details Dallin had asked her to gather, and soon after the three of them were seated together, quietly drinking tea as they spoke. Bokma asked if Sienna was the informant from the Raven's Nest, and she openly admitted it. Bokma was stunned that she had someone planted inside the Emporium, yet without that, she never would have known Dallin's location. Turning to Dallin, Sienna said she had uncovered the answers he wanted. She had identified the group behind the silver masks. Since she traced it back to the sewer incident, Dallin hadn't expected her to finish so quickly, but she once again exceeded his expectations. Still, accuracy mattered more than speed, so Dallin asked who they were. Sienna explained they were heretics worshipping a dark god, calling themselves the Apostles of Retrograde. She then revealed something more important. The book they found was Telia Shop's ledger. After examining it, she uncovered further truths. The owner of Telia Shop was an executive member of the Apostles of Retrograde. Recently, the shop had been purchasing massive amounts of medicine, metals, and weapons. All of it was being stored in an old warehouse they bought long ago and intentionally ignored. Dallin knew that location well and was shocked they had been using it all this time. Evidence showed masked soldiers there, along with kidnapped civilians and hired thugs. Their plan appeared to be turning mercenaries into semi-monsters while forcing artisans to craft weapons. It was clearly the opening move of an upcoming war. Dallin then asked if there was any progress with the Bronze Guards, since Sienna was close to the Silent Company's commander. She said she had spoken to him and that he was willing to cooperate, but without solid proof, and given the area lay outside his authority, launching an attack would be difficult. For Dallin, that wasn't an issue. All they needed was a reason strong enough for the guards to step in. As their discussion ended, night settled over the city, and somewhere nearby a man muttered about the bitter cold, complaining that winter had arrived far too harshly. They could have sent hired muscle for this kind of work instead of using true believers of the cult. Yet those fanatics were clearly guarding the building. One of them whispered for his partner to stay silent, warning that if a gold-masked enforcer overheard, death would follow. The apostles had been preparing non-stop, and their great scheme was close to beginning. Suddenly, without any sign, the companion dropped lifelessly to the ground. The remaining man had no idea what had happened, and by the time he sensed danger, Dallin was already behind him, sealing his fate. Standing over the frightened youth, Dallin demanded information about the white and gold masks. After all, he had already wiped them out. The young man stared at him in disbelief. Before he could even respond, Dallin struck him down. With both of them neutralized, there was no resistance left in that spot. Altogether, around 30 people had been stationed there. Some were posted on rooftops, others hidden in narrow alleys, but most were already unconscious, leaving no one capable of stopping him. Dallin leapt down from the roof and landed on the street below. His landing was smooth and completely silent. At this late hour, there were no drunks or beggars anywhere in sight. They had likely been taken earlier and turned into monsters. Since the cult had sped up their plans, they no longer bothered hiding in the dark. By morning, Dallin received word that the Bronze Guards would support the operation. The strategy was straightforward. Break into the building, eliminate the threats, and start fire. Once flames appeared, the guards, who would just happen to be nearby, would rush in to put it out. That would give them a lawful excuse to uncover proof of heresy. On paper, it was flawless. Still, one small detail continued to trouble Dallin. The structure had 5 levels, and the head of the Telia shop had to be somewhere inside. If an attack started, Dallin couldn't be sure whether that man would escape or remain hidden within. No matter the outcome, Dallin was ready for whatever followed. After all, whenever he had the chance, he intended to crush them completely. He paused briefly to steady his breathing. The worst possible result would be losing the shop's records and secrets. To prevent that, Dallin decided to act on his own terms. With that choice made, he moved. Dallin sprinted forward with the speed of a professional runner who never failed a test. Each step hit the ground with strength and control. Activating his newly gained skill, Dallin prepared to leap. With almost no effort, he soared close to the highest floor. While airborne, he selected an entry point. His fist drew back, ready to break in. Glass exploded as the window shattered, and Dallin landed inside. It had been a long time since he had seen this place. Rows of cells lined the interior, yet no guards were present. This prison held the half-monsters captive. They clawed at the bars, desperate to escape, but couldn't break free. The sight stirred dark memories within him. Suddenly, a voice echoed, complaining that Dallin was making too much noise and claiming that he and his apostles had witnessed the presence of a god. Yet for the first time, doubt crept into the man's mind as he questioned what he was seeing. He asked if Dallin had used magic. The man facing him was Achilles Philenum, the owner of the Telia shop. Dallin replied that he knew little about spells, but as a wealthy man, Achilles should visit a doctor to check his eyesight. With that, the clash between them began. At the start, their abilities appeared evenly matched. Although Dallin was powerful, Achilles matched him blow for blow. Their weapons collided with a ringing clash, sparks flying from every strike. Achilles realized quickly that Dallin was no ordinary man. It wasn't surprising that all the other apostles had fallen before him. Dallin, calm and unshaken, pushed Achilles back with a single, forceful hit. Catching his breath, Achilles recalled that the Grand Apostle had reasons to speed up his plans. Knowing he had to remove the barrier before him, Achilles began to chant a dark, twisted spell. Dallin recognized the signs immediately. A red aura spread from Achilles, as it seemed he was awakening the half-monsters locked in the cells. Inside, the creatures grew stronger, as if energized by some magical potion. The spell needed more time to fully work, so Dallin acted quickly before it was too late. He hurled his axe toward Achilles, aiming to distract him. Achilles raised his sword in defense, skillfully deflecting the axe and sending it spinning back into Dallin's hands. Wasting no time, Dallin leapt forward for another attack, but once again Achilles blocked him with his sword. Still, Achilles felt a chill as he realized the immense power this man held. From below, Achilles charged toward Dallin, mask and all. The first strike hit him squarely, shattering his mask. Even with the broken mask, Achilles remained focused, swinging his sword to counterattack. The two locked eyes, cold and unyielding, as their duel continued. Dallin swung his axe with precision and control, while Achilles tensed, ready to do whatever it took to survive. Once more, the two launched themselves at each other, weapons raised for another furious clash. Blows were traded nonstop as both warriors moved with terrifying speed, Dallin driving forward with his axe and forcing Achilles back. And since Dallin fought with only one hand, he kept the other ready and suddenly smashed a punch into Achilles. The strike landed perfectly and sent Achilles flying in agony, his body twisting as he nearly threw up from the pain, while Dallin calmly tracked the path of his opponent's falling body. Crashing to the ground, Achilles coughed hard as he tried to regain control of his breathing, and that brief moment should have been more than enough to end the fight, but instead Achilles spoke the words Inaxa Tarion, causing blue flames to burst into life behind him as the half-monsters nearby grew, increasingly unstable. Yet as the flames rose higher, they strangely fell under control, and for a short moment silence spread through the area before the madness returned and the creatures roared as they shattered their cells, while Dallin stood still and waited for them to close in, receiving a system message informing him that he had discovered a mage who wielded the body like a sword, which made the situation even better since experience and bodies were now coming straight to him. And when the monsters rushed him from every direction trying to trap him in the center, what emerged instead was a storm of blood and countless wounds, leaving Achilles staring in disbelief as Dallin showed no sign of exhaustion. His armor hidden beneath his tunic already destroyed by Dallin's bare fists, and gripping his sword, Achilles searched for any remaining option, realizing there was only one way left to bring down a monster like this: an ambush. So while Dallin stayed busy fighting the creatures, Achilles forced out a technique taught by the Order of Knights, pouring everything from his past into it, knowing that in his current condition he would only have a single chance. And after waiting patiently, he spotted an opening, pushed through the monsters, and lunged forward to strike Dallin. In just seconds, Achilles believed he would finally stab that bastard, or at least that was his hope, as Dallin stood with his back turned and looked completely unaware of the danger behind him, the sword closing in until Achilles was certain he had won. But the moment he reached striking distance, his blade was suddenly cut apart by Dallin's axe, an outcome that should have been impossible. And the sheer impact of the clash also shattered the axe's handle, leaving Dallin confused about why the killing strike had triggered so abruptly, while Achilles could not even begin to understand what had gone wrong. And with that, Achilles collapsed toward the ground, badly wounded, while Dallin felt irritation at losing his weapon, only to start coughing as pain tore through his own body, blood bursting from his mouth like a fountain. Yet the dragon's regeneration immediately activated as Dallin tried to check his status window, finding himself still at level 6 with solid attributes, though his body felt strained by backlash, likely from pushing his strength to the limit just to maintain balance, reminding him to act carefully. But there was still one last matter, as the system announced that the target had been defeated and confirmed the discovery of a mage who used the body as a blade, asking whether Dallin wished to claim the corpse. and as he did, he imagined how the battle might have ended if magic and swordsmanship had been used together, though that path had failed, and once the collection finished, Dallin absorbed the Bodhi's power, gaining 2 points of mana and 1 point of stamina as a skill, unlocking the ability to cast Fire Arrow, followed by a notice stating that the spell's knowledge had been transferred directly into his mind, the sensation unfamiliar and strange as Dallin wondered if this was the true nature of mana, while a small flame flickered to life in the center of his palm. It was a strange but powerful ability, and with it now his, it was time to truly toy with fire, as the building was already burning fiercely while guards outside made sure no one escaped alive, cutting down the half-monsters without mercy and sealing off every route the mass figures tried to use. And in the heart of the chaos, the guards kept pushing forward, slowly turning the tide through sheer effort, until one furious guard shouted threats at his foes, only to be blindsided by a warrior in a golden mask, his moment of carelessness allowing the enemy to slam him to the ground. And if things kept going this way, his fate would be grim. So he secretly reached for a weapon lying close to his hand, but the masked man noticed and crushed it under his boot, leaving him helpless as he accepted that this was likely the end, watching what he believed would be his final seconds and wishing desperately not to die like this. When at the very last moment something unseen saved him, though he had no idea what it was and desperately wanted to understand. And from the rooftop above stood the one responsible, Dallin, who had seen the danger and acted to stop more needless deaths, knowing the battle was far from finished and that he still had plenty of arrows left, so gripping them like throwing spears. Dallin planted his feet firmly and focused with everything he had, unable to allow even the slightest mistake. And with a single powerful motion, he hurled all 3 arrows at once, watching them cut through the air and plunge toward the ground. And when they struck, a massive shockwave erupted across the area, causing the guards who witnessed it to freeze in disbelief, stunned by what they had just seen. Still, the fight was not fully finished, and a new command rang out to wipe out the remaining enemies. But from his high vantage point, Dallin could see that the flow of battle had turned in their favor, and for the moment, that would be enough, so gripping his axe tightly, he readied himself to join the clash below, gathering his focus as he prepared to activate his jumping skill and drop down in one swift motion, launching himself with sharp precision toward the ground and locking onto a nearby foe. And when the fighting finally came to an end, the streets were littered with bodies while the wounded who survived lay scattered among them, prompting an immediate effort to save anyone who still clung to life, no matter how badly injured they were. And seeing this, Dallin realized just how vital healing potions truly were, regretting that he hadn't taken any from the old mage he once met, since having them now could have saved a few more lives, though the deal he chose instead might allow him to protect many more in the future. When suddenly someone nearby called out his name, excited to finally meet the famed mercenary Dallin, revealing himself as Gawain, the captain of the Silent Guard unit, who explained that thanks to Dallin's intelligence they had successfully carried out this operation and offered his sincere thanks on behalf of the entire battalion. And Dallin quickly noticed that Gawain was far more capable than he had expected, deciding that forming a connection with him would be worthwhile. So as they exchanged greetings, Dallin mentioned hearing that Gawain had once spoken to Elgaias about him, and Gawain admitted he already held Dallin in high regard for what he had done for Sienna, believing that after today Dallin's abilities had once again proven themselves, before wishing him success in whatever came next. And as their conversation ended, Dallin suddenly felt uneasy, suspecting he had overexerted himself and should rest soon. So he announced his departure, while Gawain reminded him that no matter how strong he was, wearing proper armor was essential since danger was always unpredictable. Dallin replied that he would be getting proper gear very soon, and by the early light of the next morning he was already walking through the city streets, having spoken earlier with the Emporium's owner who told him the place should be somewhere nearby. And when Dallin looked up, he realized he had found it, the forge that marked the blacksmith's fresh start. So stepping inside, he asked how the work was coming along, only to be warmly welcomed by Penny, who clearly hadn't expected to see him. And she quickly called out to her uncle, telling him that Dallin had finally arrived, and the timing could not have been better since Leverin had just completed the order Dallin had placed. So as Dallin looked at the chest before him, he thanked Leverin, who said he hoped the result would meet his expectations. And with that, Dallin opened the chest, his eyes settling on the armor inside. And once he put it on, he openly praised it, saying it fit perfectly and that asking Leverin to craft it had been the right choice, which clearly pleased the blacksmith, who then offered Dallin the chance to pick out weapons as well since his axe had been destroyed, leaving Dallin sincerely thankful. And while they spoke, someone else entered the forge, prompting Dallin to say his goodbyes and apologize for not being able to pay everything at once, only for Leverin to reply that the forge itself existed thanks to Dallin, adding that the equipment was exceptional and would surely make a name for them. And Dallin expressed his hope that Levern would keep forging pieces of that quality, earning a grateful response, and once outside, Dallin commented that the visitor had arrived sooner than expected, meaning the situation must be urgent. And though the man apologized for interrupting, he admitted things were indeed critical, revealing himself as Gawain, who said he urgently needed Dallin's aid and explained that the remaining heretic forces had regrouped and that the entire 8th territory of the eastern region was currently under enemy control. Riding hard on horseback, they departed the city, and along the way Dallin asked how the 8th territory had fallen so quickly, to which Gawain explained that signs of a coordinated strike had appeared and they had even located the enemy's stronghold. But when allied forces moved in, the heretics had already poured through the area, revealing that the 8th region held a concealed sanctuary. And because no one expected such an assault, that was how it succeeded, nearly preventing them from forming any proper defensive line at all, forcing every unit to regroup in a single location, while Dallin quietly noticed that events unlike those from the game were unfolding one after another, especially with something this large happening only 2 days after the shop incident. Yet this change was not entirely negative, because if history was shifting, then perhaps the path toward destruction was also drifting away. And Dallin knew deep down that he could not afford to let this chance slip by. And when they arrived at the Bronze Guard Fortress, the commanders were already assembled, where a furious hand slammed onto the table as the chief guard of the 7th Territory declared that entering the 8th would mean total annihilation and demanded to know who would bear responsibility. Only for the chief guard of the 8th Territory to argue that abandoning the civilians was unacceptable, though the 7th Territory leader twisted the words, insisting instead that they should hold a defensive position until reinforcements arrived. But that proposal was immediately challenged by the 8th Territory chief, who argued that such a delay would leave the people trapped there in constant peril, making the entire situation painfully fragile, until another guard coldly stated that preventing this disaster had been the 8th chief's responsibility in the first place. And at that moment, the 7th Territory chief smiled, his expression unsettling and corrupt, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he wanted, before suggesting they cut off the trade routes to starve the city of supplies. And it was then that Dallin finally spoke up, firmly declaring that this would not be how things ended. The chief guard of the 7th Territory shifted his sharp gaze toward the unfamiliar man, and the leader of the 8th region quickly followed, both now focused on Dallin, as he calmly stated that doing nothing would only allow the heretics to multiply and strike again, making their inaction the true crime. And those words sent the 7th Territory chief into a rage, as he refused to be lectured by a simple mercenary who did not even belong to the Order of the Bronze Knights. But Gawain immediately warned him to choose his words carefully, explaining that this very mercenary had played a decisive role in the seizure of Telia's shop. And upon hearing that, the elderly commander froze in visible shock, realizing the man before him was the one who had brought down Telia herself. And with rumors spreading faster than fire, the balance of the room quietly shifted in Dallin's favor, allowing him to continue by saying there was now only one real option left: a sudden and decisive strike, before the enemy could prepare, because that was the lesson he had learned that day, that once you step beyond fear, the only things you risk losing are possessions, a lesson few managed to grasp easily. And Gawain backed him up, stating that Dallin was right, as anyone who fought in the earlier battle knew the half-monsters were once beggars and addicts roaming the streets, meaning it was only a matter of time before the entire 8th district shared the same fate. And with that grim truth laid bare, the room fell into deep thought, leaving the corrupt old man with nothing left to argue, as the commanders admitted they were willing to help, though the initial assault had been so overwhelming that they barely managed to set up a defensive line. And while reinforcements would certainly help, none had arrived despite repeated requests, until Dallin suddenly told them that if they were waiting for aid from the Silver Territory, it would reach them very soon, prompting the others to demand how he could possibly know that, just as the ground beneath their feet began to shake. No one could tell whether the shaking came from an earthquake or an incoming assault, and soon a crowd formed outside as several figures approached, prompting one of the guards to demand their identity, since they had arrived without any prior notice. And the man leading them calmly explained that there had been a mistake and that they came from the Silver Territory, at which point Dallin added that they were representatives of the Silver Territory's magic tower, and the timing could not have been better, as it had been a long while since they last met, leading Dallin to casually call the mage an old man, which made the robed figure laugh and say he was glad to have lived long enough to be teased by a mercenary, claiming that was exactly why he liked Dallin, revealing himself as Felver Valentino, a legendary mage from El Gaia's magic tower. And during their exchange, Felver explained that he wished to grant Dallin an additional reward, promising that if any city ever faced danger and Dallin called for aid, he would come if possible. And tonight was the moment to honor that vow. So with mage support always being valuable, Dallin thanked Felver for staying true to his word, and later, under the cover of night, horses raced through the darkness with a rider urging them on, desperate to spread his message as fast as possible, guided only by the glow of a torch as they pressed forward. While Dallin glanced at those beside him and recalled the earlier discussion, and after laying out the plan once more, he asked who was willing to follow it, knowing not everyone would approve since striking first carried great risk, and he only wanted those he trusted at his side, leaving the chief of the 8th Territory to manage the region while only elite forces would enter the mines. And with that, every final detail fell into place. The Bronze Guards advancing under the command of the Silent Division leader with the mages accompanying them, as this small, focused force prepared to launch an assault against the cult of aggression. They moved steadily through the night, their footsteps swallowed by the darkness, and not far ahead the entrance to the mine came into view, where Felver paused and said he could sense an evil presence leaking from inside, and before anyone could respond, a horrific scream rang out from deep within the tunnel, causing Gawain to wonder if it was the cry of a half-monster. And as they remained alert, a human figure suddenly sprinted toward them, his face twisted with fear and barely recognizable, begging them desperately to save him. And to everyone's shock, it turned out to be the chief guard of the 7th Territory, who upon hearing a familiar voice realized the leader of the Silent Division was present and immediately pleaded for protection, claiming he had been betrayed, while Dallin quickly understood the truth, realizing this explained why the man had withheld support, as he had clearly been working with the cult. But before another word could be spoken, something seized Dallin's attention as a figure stepped forward and killed the man, coldly stating that it was sickening for a traitor to talk about betrayal. And surveying those who had just arrived, the masked man smiled in satisfaction, saying their timing was perfect since more sacrifices were needed, making Dallin realize the situation had become far more complicated and that they needed to end this quickly. And at that moment, Gawain, burning with fury, asked Dallin to leave the masked man to him, determined to handle it himself, and Dallin trusted him enough to agree, while the masked figure studied Gawain and asked who he was, finding the face strangely familiar. And after a brief pause, he recalled, tossing the disfigured corpse aside as he remembered Gawain as the son of a beggar, cruelly adding that the taste of Gawain's father's blood had been so strong he could never forget it, and those words pushed Gawain to the edge of madness. Though Felver quickly told him to hold back for now, warning that this was not the only enemy he would have to face, a statement Gawain didn't immediately understand, as Felver stepped forward while chanting softly, a small flame slowly forming in the palm of his hand. As the spell was completed, the earth beneath them suddenly collapsed as though a massive quake had erupted, and with another sharp motion of his hand, Felver forced the surrounding rocks to rise and crash down toward the masked man, burying him under stone, leaving one of the soldiers watching in stunned admiration. Though it quickly became clear this place held far more cultists than expected, as Dallin noticed figures concealed within the thick mist, realizing a mage was likely responsible for creating it. And then one of the platform's supports snapped, causing panic as several people leapt away to avoid being dragged down with it, while one of the enemies recognized Felver and clearly resented running into him here. And as the lizard man landed, his clawed foot slammed into the ground to steady himself, confirming that they had all been exposed. None of them anticipating the mage would unleash something as violent as an earthquake so early, and with the clash now unavoidable. Both sides prepared to answer with force, some of the Bronze Guards showing visible unease, while Gawain quietly readied himself, and Dallin closely watched the cultists, noting a figure behind them press a hand to the ground, signaling the arrival of the half-monsters, whose twisted bodies told silent stories of pain and torment, making one soldier whisper that they looked like creatures born from hell itself, even causing the mages to struggle to remain calm, though Dallin, in contrast, felt a strange sense of excitement, remarking that the cultists must have been enjoying themselves if they had gone so far as to bring monsters along, to which a cultist replied that anything was acceptable for the grand plan, and that he eagerly awaited turning them all into sacrifices, prompting Dallin to give clear orders, stating the mage would deal with the enemy spellcasters, Gawain would handle the lizard man, and the monsters would be his responsibility. And with that, the battle finally erupted, as everyone charged their assigned foes, Dallin sprinting across the battlefield toward the approaching monster, which immediately swung at him the moment he closed the distance. The crushing blow slammed into the ground, but Dallin had already slipped away from the impact. Using the brief opening, he launched himself into the air and came down from above, his axe cleaving downward with ruthless precision. The blade struck the creature's twisted body, burying itself deep into the deformed flesh. The sight of the monster writhing in pain filled him with a savage sense of satisfaction, and he waited for the familiar surge of experience that should have followed such a strike. Instead, nothing happened. The axe had sunk halfway into the creature's grotesque face, yet the abomination refused to die. As Dallin tried to wrench the weapon free, the monster shrieked in agony. It screamed so piercing that it rattled his ears and made him fear his eardrums might burst. This was no ordinary beast, but a creature born from infernal mana, and such beings usually possessed a mana core hidden somewhere within their bodies. The axe finally tore loose from the skull with a wet crack, and thick blood began to pour from the wound. Despite the damage, the creature's endurance was terrifying, forcing Dallin to remain cautious. He attacked again, this time striking with more control to avoid getting his weapon trapped. The monster reacted at the last moment, attempting to intercept the blow, but its movement was clumsy and ineffective. Dallin slipped past the defense and used the creature's own limb as leverage, climbing onto its massive frame. From that position, he gained the upper hand, perched once again above the monstrous body. Its warped anatomy prevented it from looking upward, and the sheer bulk of its form robbed it of agility. A perfectly balanced strike followed, devastating in its execution, leaving the creature's headless body staggering beneath him. Its enormous size had become its greatest weakness, and Dallin intended to exploit every bit of that sluggishness by driving his next attack straight toward the chest where a core might lie. Yet instinct warned him not to relax. From the writhing mass of the creature's body, a cluster of arms and grasping hands suddenly surged toward him, flailing wildly in an attempt to drag him down, and Dallin was forced to focus entirely on defending himself against the relentless assault. Even with his efforts, the countless hands continued to swarm him, tightening their circle with relentless pressure. Their movements were grotesque and chaotic, mirroring the creature's revolting face. Refusing to remain trapped in such a disadvantage, Dallin forced his body forward and exploited the strength in one arm to close the distance. This was where his combat instincts took over. In a swift motion, he drove his elbow toward the monster's hideous face once more, his forearm crashing down with every ounce of power he could gather. The impact forced the creature's face to cave deeper into its bloated body. Landing back on the ground, Dallin could see the damage spreading across the monster's battered form. Yet the fight was far from over. Without hesitation, he rushed in again, unleashing a relentless barrage of strikes that hammered into the creature's sagging belly. Blow after blow landed until the flesh split open, revealing the glowing mana core hidden within. That was the moment he had been waiting for. Channeling his fire-producing ability, he gathered blazing energy into a single point until a burning arrow took shape in his grasp. With precise intent, he released it toward the exposed core. The projectile cut through the air, leaving behind a circular trail of fire before crashing through the core and shattering it completely. Instantly, the monster's remaining heads erupted into agonized screams so loud they battered Dallin's ears. From deep within the mine, hordes of half-formed monsters began crawling out, flooding the area in a frenzied surge. The battlefield grew increasingly chaotic, and irritation began to creep into Dallin's thoughts. Amid the escalating danger, locating the Grand Apostle quickly had become critical. Nearby soldiers urgently signaled for reinforcements to assist the mercenary, recognizing that the threat extended far beyond the heretics alone. Hearing this, Dallin shifted his attention toward the source, curiosity flickering across his mind. The knights were already preparing to purge every monster in sight, while one of the mages readied an incandescent bow to unleash another devastating attack. A relentless volley of enchanted arrows rained down from above, streaking through the air before tearing into the monsters as though their bodies were nothing more than fragile parchment. Under the protective storm of magic, soldiers surged forward to reclaim the front lines with renewed momentum. Dallin had expected nothing less from the squad leader and the disciplined warriors who followed the old mage. Seizing the moment, he vaulted over the head of a lumbering monster, deciding it was finally time to abandon that chaotic section of the mine. Before leaving, however, he snatched a nearby shield for brief protection. The soldier who had been holding it was left bewildered as Dallin vanished with the equipment in hand. Using the shield as cover, Dallin bounded along the rough stone walls of the mine's corridor, skillfully weaving past the creatures that continued to crawl out from the darkness. Meanwhile, the hulking reptilian brute refused to allow the mercenary to slip ahead of him. That brief lapse in focus created the opening Gawain had been waiting for. Striking with ruthless precision, he nearly severed the lizard man's head before relentlessly pressing the attack. The masked opponent attempted to provoke him, mocking Gawain's rise from the son of a beggar to the formidable warrior he had become. Pushing the insult even further, the creature reveled in the memory of devouring Gawain's mother. As it reached behind its back and drew out two massive axes, the mask that had hidden its face slipped and clattered onto the ground. Beneath, it was the monstrous visage of a crocodile-like predator eager to taste the flesh of the beggar's son, hoping it would resemble that of his mother. Gawain remained unmoved by the grotesque taunts and instead resolved to silence the creature permanently by tearing away its ability to speak. Without the slightest hesitation, he lunged forward to clash with the crocodile man once again. Their confrontation intensified with every passing second, the violence of their struggle escalating rapidly. From a short distance away, the mage watched the duel with quiet interest, choosing not to interfere since the squad leader clearly intended to finish the battle himself, leaving the old spellcaster to simply observe the outcome for the time being. From the mage's perspective, the battle appeared to be turning decisively in their favor, with their forces steadily gaining the upper hand on every front. Curious about the enemy's thoughts, he turned his attention to the masked figure before him, wondering whether that man shared the same conclusion. The response that followed was far from reassuring, as the masked opponent remained convinced that defeat here would change nothing. According to him, nothing could prevent the rise of the Grand Apostle, and the grand design already in motion would reach completion through means no one could anticipate. Such confidence only deepened the mage's curiosity about what hidden method could still remain. Yet the masked man refused to elaborate, offering nothing more than a strange, cynical smile that hinted at countless unsettling possibilities. Elsewhere, Dallin directed his attention toward the Grand Apostle, urging him to release the twisted state he had forced upon himself by surrendering his body to demonic forces. The apostle acknowledged that Dallin's interference had ruined their plans by preventing them from gathering the sacrifices they needed. Even so, there was no regret in his voice, as the pact he had formed had granted him what he believed to be a perfected body. Instead, he seemed almost grateful toward the mercenary, praising him as a warrior watched by the gods, a hero striving to halt the coming end. The speech was cut short when an axe suddenly smashed into the apostle's face, burying itself deep into the flesh. Rather than reacting with pain, the apostle merely displayed a brief smile, fully aware that an attack of that level could no longer end his life. Holding the title of Grand Apostle meant that far greater force would be required to bring him down. Dallin, however, fell silent for a different reason altogether, his eyes catching sight of something unusual. Spread across the ground were several distinct marks that immediately drew his attention. The discovery was completely unexpected. Lying nearby were the lifeless remains of the sixth apostle, along with the body of a once-renowned warrior. Memories resurfaced in Dallin's mind, recalling the countless times he had played through this very story simply for the enjoyment of completing it. On some occasions, he had even chosen to trigger the world's downfall himself. And once he had followed the path of an apostle, the first time he had ever deviated from the usual route. That particular ending had been nothing but a long and relentless chain of deaths. Not even the apostle's own followers had escaped the carnage in that twisted ending. Mercy had never been part of that path, and every subordinate had ultimately been discarded. By pure chance, Dallin had now stumbled upon two of those fallen bodies. The Grand Apostle, however, remained locked onto him with unwavering focus, determined to turn the mercenary into yet another offering. Thrashing tentacles surrounded the battlefield, constantly shifting and making it nearly impossible for Dallin to find a clean opening to strike. The apostle had forged a pact with a lesser demon known as Arachne. Though considered low in rank, the creature possessed extraordinary regenerative powers that made its host far harder to destroy. Even while attacking relentlessly, the apostle took note of Dallin's remarkable ability to evade each assault. Despite that acknowledgement, he also understood that bringing down someone like Dallin would never be simple. Without warning, the apostle's figure began to distort as if dissolving into the air itself. In the next instant, Dallin realized his opponent had vanished. Before he could fully react, a thin cut suddenly opened across his cheek. The apostle was now moving at terrifying speed, leaving no visible gaps in his movements. Dallin raised his defenses, yet his enemy had already slipped beside him in the blink of an eye. With danger closing in from every direction, Dallin pushed his body to respond as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, one of the writhing tentacles had already coiled around him, trapping him before he could fully escape. The situation quickly turned grim. Straining against the grip, Dallin attempted to counterattack, but the apostle had already vanished once again. An unusual wave of fatigue washed over him, raising the suspicion that some form of poison had entered his body. Fortunately, the dragon's blood flowing through his veins began to mend the damage almost immediately. Even so, the recovery was noticeably slower than normal. Matching the apostle's speed, while weakened like this, would be an enormous challenge. Yet there was no room for hesitation, and Dallin prepared himself to gamble everything on a single opportunity. Meanwhile, the apostle dashed along the walls of the chamber with incredible velocity, his erratic movements designed to mislead and confuse. In a flash, he positioned himself directly behind the mercenary to strike again. This time, however, Dallin had already predicted the maneuver and stood ready to counter the attack. The apostle's tentacles reacted with equal speed, lashing out in response. Confronting the apostle once again, Dallin prepared to deliver another crushing strike. Instead of attacking immediately, he slammed his shield into the ground with force. The apostle managed to evade the impact, but several of his tentacles became trapped. This time the apostle was the one caught off guard. Taking advantage of the moment, Dallin attacked again and sliced off the top of the apostle's head. The body dropped from the force of the blow, and Dallin intended to continue the assault, but the situation changed once more. New tentacles suddenly sprouted from the apostle's head, reforming as if the damage meant nothing. The apostle seemed almost impressed by the warrior's tactics. After murmuring an incantation, his face twisted into a more monstrous form, revealing large fangs as his entire appearance shifted. With the transformation complete, a powerful spell erupted and engulfed Dallin. The force of the magic hurled him violently through the air. The impact was strong enough to trigger the regeneration from his dragon blood once again. It reminded him of a previous attempt, the moment when the great warrior had become the second body to fall before the Grand Apostle. The problem had never been Dallin's strength in that situation. What he lacked was the stamina needed to keep up with the Apostle's relentless regeneration. It had been a brief but extremely dangerous encounter. The power granted by a demon was truly overwhelming. Now the Apostle's tentacles reshaped themselves into spider-like legs. No matter what tricks the mercenary still possessed, they seemed useless against such recovery. The Apostle calmly waited for Dallin's next move, certain the mercenary was searching for a way to overcome his regeneration. The answer was simple. Only one decisive strike would end it. All Dallin needed was a single perfect attack. With heightened senses, the Apostle could hear the beating of a heart. The mercenary's presence within the rune had changed drastically. It felt as if he had become a massive boulder rooted deep into the earth. Realizing this shift, the Apostle understood he had to eliminate the growing threat immediately. The Apostle's tentacles lashed forward with lethal intent, rushing toward Dallin's face and stopping only inches away from striking. At the last moment, a single punch halted them completely, freezing their advance. With his combat ability active, Dallin confronted the creature, as if testing whether the Apostle had ever endured such a blow before. Planting his feet firmly, he triggered his jumping ability and launched himself forward. The sudden burst of speed closed the distance in an instant. Reacting quickly, the Apostle wrapped himself in layers of tentacles, hoping the writhing shield would block the incoming attack. Seeing this desperate defense, the mercenary only showed a faint smile. His fist struck with overwhelming force, driving straight through the Apostle's body. The creature recognized the strength behind that strike, admitting that Dallin's skill had pushed him into retreat. Even so, the Apostle believed this moment marked the end of the mercenary's journey. Dallin answered that belief with laughter, clearly refusing to accept such an outcome. The reaction caused the Apostle to hesitate for a brief moment while considering his next move. During that pause, the mercenary had already begun invoking a spell while still gripping the creature's body. A brilliant, incandescent light flooded the entire chamber. The Apostle had once lived without even a name. His identity had faded completely the day he offered himself to a dark god in exchange for revenge. From that moment onward, his former existence was erased, leaving behind only a servant bound to a malevolent deity. He had risen to become the grand apostle of the dwarf who twisted fate itself. His purpose had been the destruction of humanity's final stronghold, the great power hidden within the Diamond Palace. Yet none of those ambitions mattered any longer as flames consumed him without end. Even while burning in such a miserable state, he managed to drive one of his tentacles forward and impale the mercenary. That wound alone was not enough to bring Dallin down, as his own body possessed regenerative power as well. As long as the Apostle failed to create distance, the flames consuming him would never allow his body to recover. What the Apostle had not anticipated was the sudden realization that his tentacles could no longer withdraw from the mercenary's body. Dallin refused to remain passive. Even with the tentacle piercing through him, he was already drawing back his arm to strike again. There was no chance he would allow the creature to escape now. The next blow landed with brutal force, crushing the Apostle's grotesque face. Control over the situation was slipping away rapidly, and the Apostle had never imagined his end would come in a place like this. Even then, Dallin treated the moment with a cold sense of mockery, as if the battle was still far from over. Around them, the apostle's severed tentacles lay scattered across the ground. In his final moments, the apostle reflected on the strange truth that graphite and diamonds were formed from the same substance, suggesting how the highest position could one day fall to the lowest, and the opposite could happen as well. His ambition had been to reshape the world under a divine order, yet reality had proven far less obedient than he imagined. Perhaps the outcome of this battle had always been destined to unfold this way. Dallin dismissed such thoughts as meaningless rambling, believing instead that people forged their own paths through choice and will, just as he had done despite once being hunted by forces from the Diamond Palace. The apostle seemed to acknowledge that possibility before his life finally faded away. It was the first time Dallin had ever heard the final thoughts of a defeated boss monster. Now two bodies lay before him, the fallen apostle and the great warrior, and both were necessary for the rewards he sought. His proficiency rose by 1 point, and his mana increased as well. Along with that, he obtained a new ability that allowed him to manipulate ice. After claiming the second body, his strength increased by 4 additional points. The sudden surge of power was overwhelming, and his body struggled to handle it all at once. Almost immediately, pain surged through him, forcing him to endure intense waves of agony. If something unexpected happened in that moment, survival would be far from guaranteed. Enduring the pain was the only option left to him. There was no other path if he hoped to return to the real world. Without warning, Dallin suddenly found himself in a completely different place. It looked familiar, the very starting point of the story itself. He couldn't tell whether this was a dream or the result of dying and being sent back. As he focused, however, he sensed something strange. His physical body was far away from this place. Somewhere else, it was struggling to withstand the absorption of the strength points. That meant this space existed for a reason, and something here demanded his attention. Moving forward, he opened the door of the small cabin ahead of him. The sight inside stopped him immediately. The room was identical to his own, and someone sat before a computer, completely absorbed in a game. It was the same game he had once played endlessly, and the character displayed on the screen was the one he had personally created. The person moved the mouse calmly, choosing the next mission without hesitation. Dallin stood frozen, staring at the unsettling scene. It could no longer be dismissed as just a game. Memories surfaced of all the times he had played without caring about victory, the countless NPCs he had eliminated, and the moments he had abandoned people who might have been saved. He realized he had no idea how many worlds might have fallen because of his actions. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his ankle from below, desperately begging to be rescued. Shadows began to crawl out from the ground, each one pleading in the same desperate way. The person sitting at the computer was unmistakably himself, yet it represented the version of him from the past, the source of his original sin, not the man he had become. Understanding the weight of that truth ignited a deep anger within him. Even though he had stopped the destruction now, it didn't erase the guilt of everything that had already happened. Still, this path was the only chance he had to seek redemption. The moment he accepted that responsibility, the world around him began to shift. This time, he vowed that he would never abandon this world no matter what happened. Soon after, a system notification appeared before him, announcing that he had acquired a small territory. Outside the mine, the aftermath of the battle was clear as many soldiers lay wounded and all attention had shifted to aiding them. Felver stepped forward and cast one of his many spells. Translucent hands formed in the air, glowing with a gentle yellow light as they moved among the injured. One by one, they treated the wounded and accelerated the healing of their injuries. After finishing with a soldier, Felver advised him to rest before moving on. As the mage glanced to the side, he noticed someone approaching. Calm, steady footsteps echoed across the ground. Dallin had emerged from the depths of the mine, alive and unharmed. Felver had been deeply concerned about him, so seeing the mercenary return safely brought immense relief. Observing him more closely, however, the mage sensed something had changed. Almost immediately, he questioned whether Dallin had obtained the small territory that the elder mage had expected him to claim. The change had been noticeable right away. When Dallin regained consciousness earlier, it felt as though a new sense had awakened within him. Nearly all of his attributes had increased by a single point, with the exception of strength. Even his skill proficiency had improved. He suspected the reason behind this sudden growth was connected to the message he had received before waking about acquiring the small territory. Felver likely understood more about it. Although Dallin had many questions, the situation around them was far from ideal, and the mage was quickly called away to assist more wounded soldiers. Before leaving, Felver mentioned that if Dallin ever sought answers, the doors of the magical tower would always be open to him. Dallin accepted the offer, knowing he would be welcome there anytime. With that settled, his attention shifted toward the leader of the silent company. Gawain stood bent over the lifeless body of his defeated enemy. Having finally achieved his revenge, there was likely some sense of closure for him. Nearby, Dallin also spotted a young figure standing quietly. It was Tommy, who still appeared to be undergoing evaluation. After everything that had happened in the sewers, his determination had certainly been recognized. Even so, Dallin trusted that the elder mage would guide the boy properly from here on forward. At his feet lay a fallen mask, resting silently on the ground. With that, one of the forces behind the coming destruction had finally been eliminated. Even so, Dallin knew this was only the beginning. The world was still filled with dangers far beyond this battle. Powerful demons continued to wander across the land. Witches capable of bending the elements remained in the shadows. Dryads harbored deep hatred toward humans. Bloodthirsty vampires lurked unseen in dark corners, and dragons existed on a level far beyond anything he had faced so far. All of them would have to wait for now, because his strength would continue to grow, and one day he would confront each of them in turn. Holding a letter in his hand, Dallin walked through the streets while reading its contents. After his recent achievements, requests for his services had begun to flood in. Even influential figures had started visiting the tavern, hoping to catch sight of the mercenary responsible for such feats. Fame, however, also meant dealing with an endless stream of troublesome encounters. Eventually, he reached the tavern, only to find it far more crowded than he remembered. Becoming this well-known had never been his intention. Taking a seat at the bar, he calmly ordered a drink. Before long, a stranger approached and began questioning whether he was the renowned hero everyone had been talking about. The man kept speaking at length, yet Dallin could not recall ever meeting him. Frustration soon crept into the stranger's voice as he complained that none of his previous requests had received a response, accusing the mercenary's growing fame of making him forget about the city and its people. Leaning closer, the man insisted he had spent a considerable amount of money searching for him. Dallin simply brushed the stranger's hand off his shoulder and returned his attention to the drink in front of him. The motion was far from gentle, and the man's hand had felt oddly unusual. As Dallin continued drinking, the stranger suddenly began complaining that something was wrong with his arm. Furious after the encounter, the man demanded revenge and swore he would leave Dallin unable to even crawl. Gripping his saber, he suddenly lunged forward, aiming to stab the mercenary. Before he could reach his target, several arrows pierced his arm, followed by more that struck his legs and stopped him in his tracks. A woman's voice sharply warned that weapons were not meant to be waved around inside the tavern. Troublemaking customers were not welcome and could leave immediately. The voice belonged to Sienna, and the seriousness in her tone made it clear she was not joking. As the injured man staggered toward the exit, she turned her attention to Dallin and pointed out that he was late and that they needed to leave soon. When she chose to be intimidating, Sienna could be genuinely frightening. Dallin casually remarked that she had been busy scaring away troublesome patrons, though she dismissed it as nothing. According to her, the tavern's profits had grown considerably thanks to his recent reputation. Now it was time to review the mission requests, as an entire stack had arrived during the past week alone. Examining the large pile of letters, Dallin asked if she could filter them down to the most promising options. Sienna then asked whether he had any particular preferences. Dallin explained that he was looking for missions that offered stamina-enhancing potions, spells that improved vision, or rituals capable of granting similar abilities. Despite his overwhelming strength, stamina remained his biggest weakness, and he had no desire to experience that kind of exhaustion again. Sienna eventually mentioned a mission that might fit those conditions, though she admitted she did not recommend it. The request had come from an apprentice knight belonging to the Order of the Sacred Knights. The task involved slaying a demon hiding within a labyrinth and recovering a sacred sword that had been stolen. The description immediately caught Dallin's interest, and he declared that he would accept the mission. Hearing that decision, Sienna could hardly believe he actually intended to take it. Seeing the mission as a chance to explore the labyrinth, Dallin asked Sienna to contact the client. When he stepped outside, however, the scene waiting for him was far from what he expected. A woman clad in armor was confronting several men and had just challenged one of them to a duel. To ensure everything was official, she even asked if there was a notary present to witness the matter. The entire situation felt so strange that Dallin momentarily questioned whether it was real. At the same time, a number of carriages were entering the city gates. Stepping forward, Dallin introduced himself as a gold-ranked mercenary. The medallion hanging from his neck had been awarded by Gawain as recognition for his assistance. Because of that rank, the entry fee required from him was only 8 coins. After paying the amount, he felt a quiet satisfaction at how far his status had risen. Once the gates opened, he passed through them and finally reached his destination, the land of adventurers known as the Silver Territory. As he observed the city, Dallin sensed there was something unusual about it. This was the place that guarded the entrance to the labyrinth, the location where a stone of desire could be obtained. While he took in the surroundings, an elderly man suddenly approached and called out to him. Curious, the old man asked whether Dallin had come because of the labyrinth. After receiving confirmation, he began reminiscing about the adventures of his own youth. According to him, the city was a wonderful place to live, one where his entire family had eventually settled down. Dallin, however, had little interest in continuing the conversation. Before leaving, the old man offered a final wish of good fortune to the warrior who had caught the attention of the gods. When Dallin turned to look again, the man had vanished without a trace. It was an NPC he had never encountered before. The only explanation he could think of was the mysterious figure known for having many faces. Dallin was certain it had been him, and he suspected their paths would cross again. The person who had hired him was Lucia Casticheld, a woman known for her unwavering convictions. Though ruthless when dealing with demons, she was also recognized for her mercy toward ordinary people. That same woman now stood before him in the middle of a heated confrontation. Lucia demanded that a man retract his words immediately or face having his skull crushed. The accusation that had provoked her anger was simple. The man had claimed that Barrett had lost the sacred sword inside the labyrinth, preventing the mission from being completed. Defending Barrett's honor, Lucia declared that he was a knight renowned for his swordsmanship and that, unlike the men before her, he had fought bravely until the very end. The mercenary answered with a cruel remark, claiming that the sacred sword would never acknowledge someone born a bastard. That insult was enough to shatter Lucia's restraint. In a flash of anger, she drove her blade into the ground and formally challenged the man to a duel, demanding only that a notary be present to witness it. The mercenary she confronted reacted with fury, convinced she must have a death wish. Around them, onlookers began to treat the confrontation like entertainment, some even placing wagers on the outcome. The crowd quickly split into two sides, some backing the mercenary, while others supported the sacred knight. Watching the chaos unfold, Dallin rubbed his temples, convinced the entire crowd had lost its senses. Lucia ignored the spectators and repeated that all she needed was a notary. Suddenly, the mercenary stepped forward from behind her and declared that no such formality was necessary, as the only outcome would be her death. His surprise strike was already on its way toward her. Just before the attack could connect, someone intervened and insisted the fight should end immediately. Dallin stepped between them and stated that Lucia was under his protection. Both sides had already said enough, making further violence pointless. The mercenary refused to accept that and threatened to start with Dallin if he did not step aside. In response, Dallin shattered the man's club with a single strike and calmly pointed out that his opponent no longer had a weapon. The display of strength was enough to ease the tension slightly. Lucia then asked who he was, and Dallin revealed that he was the mercenary she had hired for the mission. Later, once things had settled and the two spoke in a quieter place, she expressed her gratitude for the help. She formally introduced herself as Lucia, an apprentice knight belonging to the Order of the Sacred Knights. Since the mission request had been vague, Dallin wanted to hear the full details. Lucia explained that the Sacred Knights were currently guarding another section of the labyrinth, a dangerous fissure located in the southwestern region of the continent. The region they needed to reach was known for its brutal terrain, a wild landscape without proper barriers where monsters could appear at any moment. Before venturing there, however, they would first need to stop at safer Palzion to gather the necessary preparations. Lucia explained that her companion, Barrett Strymon, had recently been promoted to officer and had traveled to Palzion ahead of her. Yet he never returned, and before long he was officially declared dead, with the news eventually reaching the Sacred Knights. Worse still, one of the 12 sacred swords had been stolen, and a suspect had already been named. The one accused was Barrett himself, her own friend. If the sacred sword had truly chosen him, he should have been able to communicate with it, which made the entire situation even more confusing. Lucia admitted she had no idea why he had never done so. Now that Dallin understood the reason behind his hiring, he asked which of the Sacred Knights would accompany him on the mission. Lucia explained that no additional forces were available in the region. With monsters becoming increasingly active, the Order simply lacked the manpower, meaning the Labyrinth expedition would be carried out by only the two of them. Realizing the opportunity before him, Dallin understood he was standing beside someone destined to become a heroine in the future. He told her he would meet her at the entrance of the Labyrinth the following day at noon. Lucia was clearly shocked by how quickly he accepted the task. Dallin then slammed his empty glass onto the table, declaring through his actions that they would recover the lost sword. Later, at the magical tower, he waited by a stone parapet overlooking the garden. When Felver finally approached, he apologized for the delay, explaining that his lecture had lasted longer than expected. Another person accompanied him and introduced himself somewhat awkwardly. It was Tommy, one of the Elder Mage's most promising students. The boy had clearly matured since the last time Dallin saw him, suggesting he had learned quite a bit. His presence made it obvious that the discussion they had not been able to finish earlier was about to continue, and that was exactly the reason they had gathered there. A powerful light began to radiate from Dallin's body as the energy within him stirred. What he truly wanted to understand was the nature of these territories he had obtained. A large aura slowly formed around him, spreading outward. The Elder Mage observed the phenomenon with clear interest, impressed that Dallin continued to surpass his expectations time and time again. To him, it was proof that Dallin possessed the potential to reach far greater heights of power. According to the mage, only those who had accepted and reconciled with their past could awaken such strength. Dallin listened carefully, realizing the words described his own experience almost perfectly. The Elder Mage then asked whether Dallin knew how to control his domain. Dallin admitted that he had no idea. The mage explained that a domain was essentially the creation of a personal fantasy world. In contrast to reality, which was bound by countless restrictions, a world of fantasy allowed limitless possibilities. Possessing a domain meant that Dallin now had access to such a realm as well. Curious, Dallin asked how he could reach the place he had claimed. Felver suggested that the best way to understand was to witness it directly, then instructed Tommy to leave and get some rest. The boy reluctantly agreed, clearly disappointed to miss what was about to happen, and offered a quick farewell to Dallin before departing. For someone at Tommy's level, witnessing a domain would be overwhelming, as the intense flow of mana could easily cause confusion. With that settled, the demonstration could begin. After casting a spell, a brilliant light surrounded the Elder Mage's body. In that moment, his domain was being drawn into reality, bringing with it possibilities that should not exist in the normal world. This was the true nature of a domain's power. Dallin could clearly sense the phenomenon as the mana flowing from the Elder Mage twisted and distorted the space around them. The sensation reminded him of his battle with the Apostle, when the flow of mana around him had shifted in a similar way. Only now did he fully understand what had occurred during that fight. After finishing the display, Felver asked if Dallin believed he could summon his own domain after witnessing it. Dallin admitted he was not capable of doing so yet, and Felver calmly explained that mastering such power would take time. Even the most powerful mages carried limitations equal to their immense abilities. Curious about the Elder Mage's own domain, Dallin asked what it was capable of. The mage explained that it possessed several functions, but its greatest power was the ability to observe the memories left behind by the land itself. Every person who had ever walked across it left traces of their existence. Through those traces, he could witness echoes of the past, and sometimes even glimpse fragments of the future. Dallin reflected on the idea that the land quietly recorded the passage of time for everything. With that thought in mind, he realized there was still one question he had long wanted to ask. Since arriving in this world, a single doubt had continued to linger in his mind: his own identity. Meanwhile, outside the labyrinth, the moment of departure was drawing closer. On the first floor, Dallin stood beside the one who had hired him. He asked Lucia whether she felt nervous, and she admitted to feeling a little uneasy. It was difficult to imagine that this same young woman would one day be known as the legendary demon slayer. Even Dallin found himself wondering how someone like her would eventually rise to become a sacred knight. Nearby, a conversation caught his attention as someone spoke about the origin of certain information. The voice belonged to the mercenary he had encountered earlier. The man insisted he had witnessed the situation himself and had no reason to lie. According to his claim, the sacred knight had already dealt a mortal wound to the demon. A weakened low-ranked demon was considered perfect bait for adventurers. Slaying monsters within a labyrinth brought significant rewards, drawing many people toward the opportunity. Yet this line of thinking carried a dangerous flaw. A demon wielding a sacred sword would only continue to grow stronger with time. Such a creature would likely hide the weapon while quietly accumulating power over the years. If the demon truly was vulnerable now, then this brief moment would be the only chance to deal with it. As the massive doors of the labyrinth slowly began to open, Dallin told Lucia to prepare herself. She had expected a portal to appear, but instead a brilliant light suddenly formed beneath their feet, spreading across the ground. The entrance to the labyrinth lay beneath them, revealed as the floor split open like massive doors. Lucia had not expected that small detail at all. Without warning, both of them dropped through the opening, and the sudden fall left Lucia completely terrified. They descended into a wide valley-like area deep within the labyrinth. Dallin managed to land without injury, but Lucia crashed face first into the ground. At last, they had truly entered the labyrinth. Confused, Lucia immediately asked where the others were. Dallin explained that the mana waves within the labyrinth were extremely unstable, making precise positioning nearly impossible. Because of that, anyone entering would be scattered randomly across the first floor. She then questioned how he seemed to know so much about the labyrinth despite it supposedly being his first time there. Dallin casually described himself as a veteran novice. Studying the constellations above, he quickly determined their position. They had landed northeast of the return point, which meant they were on the opposite side from where the sacred sword had been lost. To reach it, they would need to cross the forest stretching through the center. The cave where the demon was hiding was protected by magical barriers, and over time, it would evolve into a mana-infused lair. Understanding that risk, Dallin insisted they needed to move quickly. A sudden noise in the darkness caught his attention, causing him to grow more alert. Strangely, he considered a good sign. In his view, traveling alongside a holy knight had brought them a bit of fortune, though Lucia had no idea what he meant by that. She still felt overwhelmed by the strange chaos surrounding them. Not far away, several ghouls and massive wolves began creeping closer. Lucia readied herself for battle, remarking that the situation hardly felt lucky. Dallin leaped forward without hesitation and assured her that she would soon understand their fortune. Dropping down from above, he prepared to eliminate the first of the approaching monsters. A brilliant flash of light burst through the forest as he struck. From the shadows, a new figure appeared. Dallin had just gained himself a mount, something that would allow him to travel far more quickly toward their destination. As the night continued, the nearby monster camp remained strangely quiet. One of the creatures stood guard, staring into the distance as it kept watch over the area. Not far away, a sudden scream echoed through the darkness. The sound only deepened Lucia's fear. Overwhelmed by the situation, she begged Dallin to stop, convinced they were rushing directly toward a nest of monsters. The lookout beast suddenly howled, warning the rest of its pack. They were closing in fast and were about to collide with the crude barricade surrounding the camp. Dallin managed to dodge the obstacle, but Lucia crashed straight into the barrier. He quickly pulled her aside and checked to see if she was injured. Lucia assured him she was fine, though she was stunned by the way he had used the creature's instincts to guide them back toward its home. Because of that trick, they had traveled a remarkable distance in a very short time. In her mind, the only thing left was to escape the area immediately. Dallin, however, had a different plan entirely. Since they had already arrived at the heart of a monster nest, he intended to wipe them all out. He told Lucia to stay close and follow carefully as he prepared to fight. Activating his jumping ability, he launched himself straight into the middle of the creatures. Drawing their attention toward him, Dallin fought with remarkable skill. Lucia watched the scene unfold, realizing there was no way she could stop him now. Tightening her grip on her sword, she offered a quick prayer to the god of battle. A sharp gleam appeared in her eyes as her focus sharpened. In the next instant, she dashed through the monsters, her blade flashing as it cut them down one after another. Dallin had not expected much from her at first, considering she was still only an apprentice. Yet her talent was undeniable, and the potential for her to become the heroine she was destined to be was clearly there. Seeing her abilities firsthand, Dallin realized he had little reason to worry. With renewed confidence, he continued moving through the battlefield. Together, the two of them pressed forward, relentlessly cutting down every monster that surrounded them. After a long and exhausting battle, the two warriors finally steadied themselves. Surrounded on all sides, they stood back to back, ready for whatever came next. Lucia muttered that the monsters seemed endless, as if the swarm would never stop. Dallin calmly asked if she knew how to force them into retreat. She replied that such tactics were part of her training, meaning she understood what needed to be done. Around them, the monsters snarled and crept closer, and Lucia remarked that the fight was reaching its final stage of destruction. Before she could continue, however, a deep roar thundered from a nearby structure. A spear suddenly slammed into the ground, gripped by a towering creature that stepped forward. This was clearly their leader, and if the necklace around its neck were destroyed, the rest of the monsters would flee. As the massive figure appeared, the surviving beasts immediately lowered themselves in submission. It seemed their commander had grown tired of watching his subordinates fall one after another. At that moment, the system alerted Dallin that he had discovered two additional bodies, the first traveler to the labyrinth and a seasoned warrior. Dallin suggested that Lucia take a moment to rest while he handled the creature alone, but she stubbornly insisted she could still contribute. The moment she finished speaking, pain shot through her body, a clear result of pushing herself too far. She realized she had spent far too much energy dealing with the earlier scouting group. Even so, she couldn't help noticing that Dallin showed no signs of fatigue. Curiosity crept into her mind as she wondered what kind of leader this wolf-like monster truly was, a commander who had allowed his soldiers to fight, yet now stepped forward to face the mercenary himself. The beast lunged forward, and their weapons soon collided with tremendous force. Dallin instantly recognized the creature. It was Bargof, a monster destined to one day become a subordinate of the Eagle God. The beast demanded to know the identity of the intruder who had invaded his territory and slaughtered his followers. Dallin was genuinely surprised, never expecting the creature to be capable of speech. Dallin answered that no special reason was needed to hunt creatures that preyed on humans. From the wolf's own words, it was clear the beast had formed a pact with an evil god. Such a pact demanded 10 human hearts as an offering, and the monster noted that Dallin was clearly no ordinary man. Irritated by the constant talking, Dallin made it clear he had no patience left and intended to end the fight quickly. The wolf took that as pure arrogance and swore he would torture the mercenary before finally devouring him. Dallin replied with cold sarcasm, hoping the beast would at least put in a decent effort. The two charged toward each other once again. Their clash exploded with such force that debris and dust erupted across the battlefield. Lucia waited nervously for the cloud to clear so she could see the outcome. When the dust settled, Dallin was caught in the wolf's powerful grip. The monster mocked his bravery, but Dallin dismissed the taunt without concern. He had expected Bargof to lack intelligence, but not enough to leave his hands free. Drawing on the ice magic he had recently acquired, Dallin unleashed the spell and instantly froze the wolf's arm. In the past, he had relied heavily on magic, and now that skill proved useful again. Bargof's limb quickly became encased in solid ice. The beast snarled furiously, warning that the battle would not end as Dallin imagined. Yet Dallin had already activated his combat ability and prepared to shatter the frozen limb. With a single devastating strike, the wolf's arm broke apart, leaving it severed. Bargof stared in disbelief before rage consumed him completely. Taking advantage of the moment, Dallin created distance and readied his next attack while moving in again. The wolf staggered, shaken and confused by what had just happened. Feeling overwhelmed by the human before him, Bargof growled that he had not even begun to use his true power. 10 hearts had granted him intelligence, and 20 had given him the strength to crush stone itself. Bargof declared that after consuming 30 more hearts, he had gained the power of regeneration. Enraged, the wolf swore he would tear Dallin to pieces. Dallin remained calm and simply urged the monster to try its best. Their battle raged on, but despite the wolf's strength, he struggled to gain any advantage. Dallin wondered if his actions were altering the events of the game, since Bargof was never supposed to have formed this contract yet. Another violent clash sent dust swirling through the air while Lucia watched anxiously, hoping the mercenary was unharmed. Standing there doing nothing unsettled her, and she hated being reduced to a mere spectator. Then growls echoed behind her as several wolves approached, and the sound lifted her spirits. At last, she had a role to play. Gathering the last of her magic, Lucia deliberately provoked the monsters and drew them toward her. Meanwhile, the wolf leader, though exhausted, glared at Dallin and asked what he thought of the situation. His wounds had already healed, leaving Dallin seemingly unable to stop him. Dallin admitted that regeneration was indeed an impressive ability, but as flames began to gather in his hands, he revealed his curiosity about something else. He wondered what would happen if the wolf were burned completely. The sight of fire immediately unsettled Bargof. Before the beast could react, Dallin's next punch struck with enough force to pierce straight through his chest. Drawing his sword, Dallin prepared to continue the assault, fully intending to burn the creature alive. However, the attack did not unfold as he expected. The blade failed to cut as cleanly as he hoped, and sensing an opportunity, the wolf quickly offered a bargain. Bargof claimed he kept a chest in his cabin filled with relics taken from the humans he had killed. If Dallin spared him, he would surrender everything. Dallin thanked the monster for the information, and believing his life had been saved, the wolf relaxed. Slowly, Dallin lowered his sword. In the next instant, Dallin ended the conversation by swiftly decapitating the wolf, completely ignoring the offer. Even though Bargof had gained power from an evil god, the words he spoke had been nothing but repulsive. With the battle finally over, Dallin turned his attention to Lucia. He had expected her to be exhausted, yet she had managed to defeat the remaining monsters on her own. He praised the sacred mage for her efforts, and she returned the compliment, acknowledging the mercenary's strength. With the fighting finished, it was time for them to continue onward. However, Lucia seemed startled by the sight of Dallin, his body covered in blood from the battle. Noticing her reaction, he asked what was wrong. For a brief moment, she admitted he had looked like a monster to her. Elsewhere, a demon sensed that another of his pawns had fallen. After the cultist, the wolf had been the next to die, and the demon could hardly believe that both had been defeated by humans. This was Anaxagus, the one who sought to manipulate the future itself. His ambition was nothing less than to overthrow the gods and claim their throne. Inside the hall where he stood, surrounded by lifeless bodies, a new group of people arrived. Among them was a hunter who boldly declared he would sever the demon's head and keep it as a trophy. Anaxagus, already bored by the constant stream of dungeon explorers, simply ordered his corrupted knight to rise. At first, the newcomers assumed it was only a puppet, but when the knight stepped forward, revealing a gaping hole through his chest, it became clear that the figure was none other than Lucia's deceased friend. The hunter confidently announced his plan to destroy the puppet before dealing with its master. Yet before he could even finish speaking, a blade was already slicing toward his throat. In moments, the entire group was slaughtered without any chance to defend themselves. Watching the massacre unfold, the demon smiled with satisfaction. To him, this was nothing less than the work of a masterpiece. Before Dallin lay the two bodies he had discovered earlier. As he began collecting them, the system responded immediately. His proficiency increased by 1 point, followed by a rise in his stamina as well. Another point in proficiency appeared, and along with it came a new skill. Lapintella's pulverizing sword turned out to be far more impressive than he had expected. Later, Dallin sat quietly beside a small campfire, reflecting on everything he had gained. Curious about his current state, he opened his status window to examine his progress more carefully. Along with a newly acquired skill, both his proficiency and stamina were steadily catching up to his strength. Now only 10 points separated his stamina from his total strength, which meant the chances of suffering another episode like before were greatly reduced. Among all the rewards he had obtained, the most valuable so far was the pulverizing sword skill, which had come from the last body he collected. As he imagined combining that ability with the power of his dragon blood, Dallin felt eager to test the two together in battle. Yet as he considered the skill and the experience he had gained, another thought surfaced. He remembered his encounter with the elder mage who had once asked him who he truly was. Using his mysterious abilities, the old man had revealed something Dallin never expected to hear. His total life expectancy was only 2 years and 1 month. Of all the possibilities, that revelation had been the most shocking. Since arriving in this world, 2 full years had already passed, meaning his body had likely been created the very day he appeared here. The elements of the game were clearly intertwined with this reality, and Dallin could not help but wonder why he had been reincarnated in the first place. Perhaps he had been brought here simply to relive the experiences of the game once again. No matter how much Dallin tried to piece it together, none of his theories truly made sense. Eventually, he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the goal that mattered most to him. The legendary item capable of granting any wish, the Stone of Desire. He had to find it no matter the cost, because it was his only hope of returning to Earth. As he sat there thinking, someone approached and quietly called his name. Lucia had noticed the troubled look on his face and wanted to know what was bothering him. Dallin dismissed the concern, claiming it was nothing, and instead asked why she was awake when it wasn't her turn to keep watch. Lucia admitted she couldn't sleep and offered to take over his watch early. Dallin declined, saying he preferred to remain by the fire a while longer, quietly watching the flames. After everything that had happened, it was understandable that rest wouldn't come easily to her. The loss of her comrade must have weighed heavily on her mind. After a moment, Dallin continued the conversation and asked what kind of person Barrett had been. If the sacred sword had truly recognized him, then he must have been someone remarkable. Lucia confirmed that he was, but not only because of the sword. The Barrett she remembered had been the most loyal sacred knight she had ever known. His character and sense of honor were so admirable that both new recruits and experienced knights respected him deeply. Lucia herself had always looked up to him. Barrett treated everyone with kindness and carried himself in a way that inspired admiration, which was why the accusations against him made no sense to her. She refused to believe he had stolen the sacred sword and couldn't understand how it had somehow ended up in the hands of a demon. Hearing this, Dallin admitted that the situation indeed sounded strange. If Barrett had truly been chosen by the sword, he couldn't have been an ordinary knight, and if he had companions with him, a low-level demon should never have been able to defeat them so easily. According to the accounts of the other mercenaries, Barrett had even managed to wound the demon in the stomach during the fight. If that was true, the creature should not have been such a difficult opponent. Yet before Dallin could think further about it, Lucia interrupted, saying that if Barrett had truly fallen while fighting evil, then she was proud to have once served beside him as a knight. Dallin replied that if Barrett had comrades who respected him so deeply, he was surely grateful to her wherever he might be now. Although his words were meant to comfort her, they only made Lucia more emotional. Just as she began thanking him for the kindness, a sudden arrow flew through the air, passing dangerously close to her head. Dallin reacted instantly, deflecting it before it could become a fatal strike. Even before fully understanding the situation, he was already alert and ready for any threat. Calmly, he remarked that only a fool would shoot such a careless arrow and immediately sent the projectile back toward where it had come from. His aim was perfect, striking a shadow hidden among the trees. The mysterious attacker failed to dodge and, in their final moment, couldn't even comprehend how Dallin had managed such a precise shot. As the body collapsed lifeless to the ground, Dallin was already scanning the area for more enemies. Soon, several hostile figures appeared, muttering that they should have ambushed him while he was still asleep. Their approach puzzled Dallin, since his heightened senses should have detected them much earlier. Then a familiar figure stepped forward. It was a mercenary Dallin had encountered before, who now claimed that he had lost a companion because of him. With a mocking tone, the bald mercenary added that it had also been quite a while since he had seen that foolish girl. Furious at the insult, Lucia snapped back and called the man ugly. Dallin immediately recognized him as the bald-headed mercenary they had encountered earlier and demanded to know how long they had been followed. The man only scoffed, saying it was none of Dallin's business. He had come for one reason, to settle the score from their confrontation at the tavern. Without hesitation, he ordered his men to attack. Remaining calm, Dallin called out to Lucia and asked if she didn't deserve to hear the testimony of someone who had supposedly witnessed her comrade's final moments. The mention of Barrett made her hesitate as the memory of him flashed through her mind, but after a moment, she tightened her grip on the sword's hilt. With renewed determination, she agreed that she deserved to hear the truth. Now it was time for them to show what happened to minor players who stepped into a story filled with brutal battles. Dallin moved first, charging straight toward the approaching group. The attackers shouted for him to die, believing their numbers alone would guarantee victory. Steel clashed violently as Dallin crossed blades with one of them, trading several rapid strikes. After toying with the man for a moment, Dallin mocked him, saying he was slower than a senile old man. The mercenary could hardly understand how his opponent moved so quickly, but while he struggled to process it, Dallin slammed his head into the ground with crushing force, cracking the earth beneath the impact. He pressed the man's skull deeper into the dirt just to make sure he wouldn't get back up again. Nearby, another mercenary froze in terror after witnessing the scene. Dallin slowly approached him like a figure from a nightmare, and the man began to stammer, begging him not to come any closer. His plea ended in a sharp scream that echoed through the night, leaving him to discover firsthand whether any god would answer. Meanwhile, Lucia steadied herself and took a deep breath. A brilliant light soon enveloped her blade as she focused her power, calmly inviting the remaining mercenaries to face her. One of them stepped forward with arrogant confidence, declaring that it didn't matter if she was a sacred knight. In his eyes, bones were still bones, and his sword was more than brutal enough to break them. Lucia avoided the attack with ease, leaping into the air while mocking the heavy chunk of metal the man dared to call a sword. She remarked that he was slower than a drunken infant before unleashing a rapid series of strikes while still airborne. The mercenaries below struggled desperately to defend themselves against the relentless assault. Then, with a sharp and merciless blow, one of them lost a piece of his body. Lucia scoffed at how easily they fell, remarking that they were good at talking but completely useless when it came to real combat. Nearby, Dallin watched the scene with approval, impressed once again by how she continued to exceed his expectations. Frustrated by the situation, the bald mercenary cursed his men, calling them worthless fools. Realizing the fight was turning against him, he tried to slip away quietly, hoping his escape would go unnoticed. However, Dallin immediately called out to Lucia, telling her to finish off the second-rate underlings while he went after their leader. What the bald mercenary had done was not something he intended to forgive. As Dallin gave chase, one of the remaining mercenaries foolishly attempted to attack him from behind, as if eager to hasten his own death. Dallin glanced back with disbelief at the man's audacity before activating his jumping ability. In an instant, he launched himself high into the air, completely out of reach, leaving the fool alive so Lucia could continue her training against him. Ahead of him, the bald mercenary ran desperately, trying to escape the two terrifying figures pursuing him. Panic was written all over his face, thick veins bulging across his shiny head as he fled. He swore to himself that one day he would get his revenge, but Dallin was already closing the distance. Suddenly, a thunderous crash echoed through the forest as Dallin dropped down from above and landed directly on top of him, pinning the man to the ground. Dallin mocked him for abandoning his own companions so easily. Just as he held him there, a voice unexpectedly called out from nearby, catching Dallin off guard. It seemed there had been another figure hiding among them all along. The hidden figure finally revealed himself and called out to Dallin, asking him to spare the remaining mercenaries from further slaughter. Dallin showed little interest in the request, unwilling to end the fight simply because a stranger had asked him to. Anyone who tried such schemes deserved a harsh lesson. The bearded man then noticed the large chest Dallin was carrying and casually pointed it out, hinting that such a prize was hard to ignore. The remark put Dallin in an awkward position. He had originally wanted to leave the chest with Sienna, worried that forcing it open himself might break whatever was inside. Seeing an opportunity, the bearded man tried to bargain for his life by offering a strange totem that could cancel all sound within a certain radius. At that moment, things finally made sense. That was how the mercenaries had managed to approach without triggering Dallin's heightened senses. Curious, Dallin said he wanted to test the object first. The bearded man agreed, but insisted that Dallin come closer to examine it. The malicious grin on his face betrayed his true intentions. He believed he had found the perfect chance to ambush Dallin at close range, gripping his square-shaped weapon and preparing to strike. Dallin, however, had no patience for deceit. The bearded man mocked him, claiming that no one could dodge a bullet at such distance. Yet before the sentence was even finished, Dallin had already closed the gap between them. In those final seconds, the man realized just how foolish his plan had been. Dallin's strike landed with overwhelming force, fueled by anger at being treated like a fool. The impact drove the breath from the mercenary's body, leaving him writhing helplessly on the ground. While the man struggled to breathe, Dallin demanded to know where they had come from. Taking his identification plate, he confirmed they were mercenaries and that the bearded man's name was Boris, a fighter carrying a golden rank plate. But Dallin had not forgotten the bald mercenary who had started all of this. Turning his attention back to him, he coldly asked how much longer he planned to keep running. With time clearly running out, Dallin decided it was time to get straight to the point. Dallin stepped closer to the bald mercenary and demanded to know who had stabbed the sacred knight in the back. The man was stunned, unable to understand how Dallin had discovered such a thing. Calmly, Dallin explained that a sacred knight like Barrett would never have been defeated so easily in a fair fight. The bald mercenary now had a choice: tell the truth or suffer a slow death. Under the pressure, the man finally broke and confessed that he had been the one who attacked Barrett from behind. He had believed that by betraying the knight, he could seize the sacred sword and earn a reward from the demon. Both of them had already been badly wounded when it happened. At that moment, Lucia arrived and heard the confession with her own ears. The truth struck her like a blade. Her friend had died because of this coward's betrayal. The bald mercenary tried to justify himself, admitting that what he had done was wrong and attempting to apologize. But words could not undo what had already happened. With a single swift motion of her sword, Lucia cut into him, tearing through his body and leaving him in pieces. Staring down at him coldly, she declared that this was only the beginning and that he would receive no mercy. The mercenary, now crawling across the ground, his body ruined and bleeding heavily, began to regret everything he had done. Lucia exhaled slowly, saying that thanks to the demon allowing him to escape earlier, she had been given the chance to avenge her fallen comrade. Now the time had come for him to pay with his life. Facing death, the bald mercenary desperately begged for mercy, promising he would do anything if she spared him. For a brief moment, Lucia hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her mind. But the moment quickly passed. In the end, she struck him down without hesitation. Mercy was for the weak, and she was a sacred knight. A faint yellow light began to glow from her blade, and soon that light spread across the mercenary's broken body. His screams echoed through the forest as the radiance consumed him, marking the final end of his life. Dallin hadn't expected to see flames like those in a place like this. They were white flames, divine in origin, known as demon-slaying flames. As they burned, they regenerated the victim's nervous system, forcing them to feel every moment of agony until their life was completely extinguished. Soon nothing remained of the once arrogant bald mercenary except ashes scattered before Lucia. Dallin asked if she was all right, knowing how heavy the emotional weight of this moment must be for her. She replied that there was nothing to worry about. He congratulated her on what she had done and hoped she would overcome this moment and continue living without regrets. Still caught in her emotions, Lucia thanked him, saying that it was thanks to Dallin that she had been able to preserve her friend's honor. Dallin corrected her, telling her it wasn't his doing but hers, since she had never doubted Barrett or his character. Hearing that, She thanked him again. Impressed by Dalin's performance, she even suggested renegotiating the reward for their mission, to which Dalin casually replied that there was no such thing as too much money. The remark eased the tension between them and brought a wide smile to her face. She then said she would rather keep moving, since she doubted she could sleep anytime soon. As they continued their journey, Dalin collected another body and gained 1 point of mana. He obtained additional abilities, and after consuming a medicinal herb, he gained another point of stamina. One more body granted him an extra point in his senses. With these gains, the preparations felt complete. Eventually, they arrived before a dark cave, which seemed likely to be their final destination. Lucia commented that something about the entrance felt strange, but Dalin replied that a demon's lair would always feel unnatural and warned her that hidden enemies were probably waiting nearby. Leading the way, Dalin told Lucia to stay close behind him as they entered the cave, its ceiling crowded with jagged stalactites hanging low above their heads. As they advanced deeper inside, Lucia suddenly noticed something strange. The path ahead appeared to end abruptly, blocked by a massive stone wall. Suspecting it might be sealed by magic, Dalin placed his hand against the surface to test it. In that instant, he sensed something dangerous and quickly warned Lucia to prepare herself. A violent explosion erupted without warning, nearly catching them off guard. From within the darkness, a demon's voice echoed through the cave, laughing as it asked if its greeting had been too rough. The creature welcomed them mockingly and boasted that it had been watching their journey as if from the stars. Enraged by the taunt, Lucia could barely contain her desire to tear the demon apart with her sword. Dalin, however, responded with dry politeness, thanking the demon for such a warm welcome and saying it was only fair that he return the favor. Amused by the challenge, the demon encouraged him to try his best, promising to answer with equal care and kindness. After exchanging these sarcastic courtesies, the battle began in earnest. As the clash intensified, Lucia used Dalin as a stepping point and launched herself high into the air. Suspended above the battlefield, she prepared to strike the demon with everything she had, determined to avenge her fallen comrade. Yet the demon below appeared strangely calm, making no effort to react. Dalin immediately realized it was a trap and shouted for her to stop. But as Lucia closed in, the demon unleashed a devastating attack. The blast struck with overwhelming force, making Lucia cough up blood mid-air. Dalin rushed forward and caught her before she could crash to the ground. And for a moment, both of them stood stunned by the power of the attack. The demon had been deemed low level. Its overwhelming strength told a completely different story, leaving no room for hesitation as the battle intensified. In the midst of the chaos, Dalin quickly pieced together the truth, realizing the creature was drawing power from a sacred sword concealed deep within the dungeon. With the situation spiraling, he understood that holding back was no longer an option. Tapping into his domain, a force capable of bending reality itself, Dalin began to turn the tide of the fight. The demon's earlier arrogance started to crack under the suffocating pressure that now filled the battlefield, as it came to recognize that the human before it was anything but ordinary. Even so, the demon stubbornly clung to its confidence, convinced that defeat was impossible regardless of Dalin's efforts. Unshaken, Dalin remained firmly in place, anticipating the incoming attack, and when it finally struck, he dismantled it effortlessly. Wasting no time, he surged forward, pushing the demon further into disbelief as the situation slipped beyond its control. Determined to finish the fight, Dalin pressed on without hesitation, while the demon's composure began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of panic as it realized the very real possibility of a painful end. In a desperate attempt to protect itself, the demon erected a magical barrier, relying on it as a final safeguard. Irritated by its arrogance, Dalin responded with sheer force, unleashing a devastating strike that shattered the defense entirely. Though the blow did not end the fight, it tore away several of the demon's horns, leaving it visibly weakened. Refusing to relent, Dalin continued his relentless assault, keeping the pressure constant. Fueled by anger, the demon lashed out in retaliation, but despite its raw power, it failed to land a single hit on the unyielding human. The strain of maintaining such overwhelming strength began to wear heavily on Dalin's body. Yet his enhanced stamina allowed him to endure, as without it, he would have already been torn apart by the sheer toll of his own power. In front of him, the demon writhed in pain, one arm left badly damaged as its cries echoed with shock at the failure of its malicious body to regenerate from the heavy blows. Even in such a crippled state, it struggled to accept that Dalin, a mere human who had only just entered the labyrinth, could command a territory with such mastery. Driven by desperation, the demon summoned its corrupted knight to shield it, and a sorrowful figure stepped between them, its chest torn open by a gaping wound. Though reduced to little more than a body, the knight retained enough skill to intercept Dalin's strike, halting his momentum and disrupting his plans, as he had not accounted for another opponent entering the fray. As the clash continued, Dalin began to sense something deeply unsettling about the knight, and it soon became clear that this was no ordinary enemy, but his sacred knight. Seizing the opportunity, the demon turned and fled, ordering the corrupted figure to stall for time, and Barrett's body obeyed without hesitation, standing firmly in Dalin's path. This development was even more alarming, as a low-class demon should never have been capable of controlling a sacred knight, prompting Dalin to notice the strange chain fastened around Barrett's neck. The artifact revealed itself to be Halman's chains, a relic with the terrifying ability to bend others to the will of its master, finally explaining the unnatural control at play. Realizing the danger, Dalin understood that the situation had grown far worse, and that he needed to act quickly before the demon could fully recover. Behind him, Lucia's voice trembled with guilt as she struggled under the weight of the moment, acknowledging that her friend Barrett's body had been overtaken by evil and that resolving it was her responsibility. Determined, she urged Dalin to continue chasing the fleeing demon while she dealt with what remained of her fallen companion, tightening her grip on her sword as she accepted the harsh truth that the holy knight standing before them was already dead. With no better option, Dalin chose to place his trust in her judgment. Lucia Castacheld stepped forward with resolve, declaring her role as an apprentice knight and investigator tasked with eliminating corruption among the sacred, now burdened with the duty of purifying Barrett's body. Without hesitation, she lunged toward the corrupted knight, who advanced to meet her under his master's command, their blades colliding in a fierce and relentless exchange. At the same time, the demon, having partially regenerated, felt a surge of excitement as its strength returned. Dalin quickly closed the distance, recognizing the change and realizing the creature had drawn even more power from the sacred sword. With renewed confidence, the demon prepared for another confrontation, believing the tide had shifted in its favor. The battle resumed, but the intensity had risen, as the demon now wielded a newly formed weapon that made each clash more dangerous. Understanding the escalation, Dalin decided to unveil his newly acquired ability, his body becoming engulfed in a crimson glow as he activated the pulverizing sword. The demon's desperation deepened as it recognized the overwhelming threat before it. Unable to comprehend how someone it deemed insignificant could wield both a territory and such destructive power. Driven into a corner, it launched a final assault, only for its weapon to be effortlessly destroyed upon impact with Dalin's defense. In the next instant, Dalin's counterattack cut through the demon with unstoppable force, slicing it apart and bringing the battle to a brutal end. The sheer power of the strike caught even Dalin off guard, leaving him momentarily stunned by his own strength. As silence settled over the dungeon, the aftermath revealed two additional lifeless bodies lying within the ruins. Elsewhere, Lucia's battle with Barrett continued without pause, their blades clashing repeatedly as neither side yielded. Yet despite her determination, hesitation lingered within her, holding her back from delivering the final blow.